The afternoon sun hung low over the sprawling campus of Jefferson High, bathing the school's pickup area in a warm, golden glow that softened the edges of the cracked pavement. Typically, this was a place alive with the carefree chatter of students spilling out of classrooms, their voices weaving a tapestry of laughter and fleeting goodbyes as they scattered toward waiting cars or the promise of freedom beyond the school gates. But today, an unsettling stillness clung to the air, as though the world itself sensed a shift to quiet before an inevitable storm. At the edge of the lot sat Tiana Brooks, a 14-year-old whose presence carried a quiet strength, her wheelchair positioned where the asphalt met a patchy strip of grass. Her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack, knuckles whitening slightly as she adjusted it on her lap, her posture upright despite the weight of a day spent navigating a world that often stared too long, or not at all. Tiana's sharp brown eyes flickered toward her watch, a faint crease forming on her brow. Her father, Malcolm Brooks, was not unusual for a man whose life revolved around precision and promises kept. She sighed softly, the sound swallowed by the hum of distant traffic, and let her thoughts drift to the science project waiting at home, a meticulously planned model of a Mars rover, its tiny wheels and solar panels a testament to her dreams of exploration. She could almost hear her father's voice, warm and steady, promising to help her solder the circuits just right. Malcolm was her anchor, a towering figure whose love wrapped around her like armor, forged through years of kitchen table conversations, where he'd recount his latest cassatales of justice served that made her eyes shine with pride. Today, though, his absence gnawed at her, a small thorn of impatience pricking her otherwise calm demeanor. Around her, the crowd thinned as cars pulled away, leaving behind the faint echo of slamming doors and the occasional shout of a friend, calling out one last joke. The late autumn breeze rustled the leaves overhead, sending a few spiraling down to skitter across the ground like forgotten confetti. Tiana shifted in her chair, the metal frame creaking faintly under her weight, and let her gaze wander past the chain-link fence, over the blur of passing traffic to a horizon she longed to chase. For a fleeting moment, everything felt ordinary, a snapshot of a teenage life poised on the cusp of something bigger. But that fragile peace shattered when a shadow stretched across her, cold and unyielding, blotting out the sun's warmth. Officer Ethan Grayson loomed before her, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement with a rhythm that seemed to demand attention. He was a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with a face hardened by years of wielding authority like a blunt instrument. His uniform was crisp, the badge glinting on his chest a silent proclamation of power. But his eyes narrow and flinty carried a disdain that made Tiana's stomach twist. She tilted her head up, offering a small, polite nod, the kind she'd been taught to give as a shield against the world's sharper edges. But his stare didn't soften. It sharpened, slicing through her gesture with contempt. "What are you doing here?" His voice cracked through the air like a whip, each word laced with an accusation she couldn't yet grasp. Tiana blinked, her breath catching as confusion flooded her mind. She opened her mouth, hesitating under the weight of his hostility. "I'm just waiting for my dad to pick me up, sir," she said, her tone soft but steady, a thread of courtesy woven through her words despite the tremor she felt building inside. Grayson's lips curled into a sneer, his head tilting as though her answer was some kind of insult. "Don't sir me," he snapped, his voice rising to drown out the fading sounds of the lot. "I've seen your type hanging around here. You people always find a way to stir up trouble. So what are you really doing?" The words hit her like a gust of icy wind, stealing the air from her lungs. Her throat tightened, a lump forming as her sweaty palms pressed harder against the armrests of her chair. She didn't understand cowled fathom way he looked at her as if she were a threat, a puzzle he'd already decided didn't fit. "I am just waiting," she stammered, her voice quivering now, fragile under the heat of his glare. He scoffed, a harsh sound that grated against her ears, and leaned closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You think you can play the sympathy card with that chair? Think it makes you untouchable?" His words were venom, each syllable dripping with a prejudice she'd felt before, but never so openly wielded. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she couldn't quiet, as the stares of a few lingering students prickled against her skin, curious, uncomfortable, but too distant to help. She wanted to shout, to tell him he was wrong, to demand why her mere existence seemed to offend him so deeply. But the words wouldn't come. They tangled in her chest, trapped behind a wall of fear and disbelief. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely reached him. A plea lost in the wind. Grayson didn't hear or didn't care. His hand darted forward, fingers wrapping around the arm of her wheelchair with a grip that made the metal groan. He jerked it slightly, a petty show of dominance, and spat, "Don't get smart with me. Kids like you always think you're above the law. I'll show you otherwise." Panic surged through Tiana like a tidal wave, crashing over her senses as her voice broke free. "Please, you're hurting me," she cried, the words raw and desperate. He didn't relent. Instead, he yanked harder, tilting the chair just enough to send a jolt of instability through her. Her breath hitched, her hands scrambling to steady herself as the world tipped precariously. Tears stung her eyes, hot and insistent, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to let them fall. She wouldn't give him not the satisfaction of seeing her break. Then, cutting through the chaos like a lighthouse beam through fog, came a voice calm, measured, yet heavy with an unspoken fury. "Let her go." The command hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, and Grayson froze, his grip faltering as he turned slowly to face the source. There, stepping from the shadow of a nearby tree, stood Malcolm Brooks, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the fading light. He was a figure carved from resolve, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw tight, his dark eyes locked on the scene with the intensity that could have stopped a freight train. The sight of him flooded Tiana with relief, a warm tide washing away the edges of her fear, though the air around them crackled with a tension thick enough to choke on. Grayson straightened, his bravado flickering as he sized up the newcomer. "And who do you think you are?" He sneered, but a thread of unease wove through his tone, betraying the crack in his armor. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to Tiana, softening for a heartbeat, a silent promise that she wasn't alone before snapping back to Grayson. With a cold, cutting edge, "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word a blade honed to pierce. "A mistake you won't walk away from." The officer's bravado wavered, his smirk twitching as he tried to reclaim his footing. "Oh, is that so? What are you gonna do, sue me?" "Go ahead. See how far that gets you." He puffed out his chest, clinging to the shield of his badge. But Malcolm's next words sliced through the air like thunder rolling down a mountain. "I'm not here to sue you. I'm here to hold you accountable." Grayson's smirk faltered fully now, confusion tangling with defiance as he barked, "What the hell are you talking about?" Malcolm took a step closer, his presence swelling until it seemed to fill the space between them. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his tone chilling, a promise wrapped in ice. "But when you do, remember this moment. Remember the girl you tried to break. Because she's stronger than you'll ever be, and she has people who'll fight for her." Grayson's hand slipped from the wheelchair, his confidence crumbling under the weight of Malcolm's unwavering stare. The tension didn't dissipate. It coiled tighter, a serpent poised to strike, as if the universe itself held its breath, waiting for the scales of justice to tip. Tiana looked up at her father, tears spilling down her cheeks, at last not from fear, but from a swell of emotions she couldn't name: relief, gratitude, the faint glimmer of hope taking root. Malcolm hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lunged or lashed out, but the storm brewing in his silence was palpable, a force Grayson couldn't ignore despite his bluster. The officer's gut churned with a primal instinct. Didn't know this man, but something deep and unshakable told him he'd crossed a line that would haunt him. What Grayson couldn't have known, what his narrow world couldn't have prepared him for, was that Malcolm Brooks wasn't just a father shielding his child. He was an FBI agent, a veteran of shadows and secrets, a man who'd spent decades peeling back layers of corruption, toppling men who thought their power made them invincible. And now Grayson stood on the precipice of a reckoning, his badge a flimsy shield against the weight of truth crashing down. As Malcolm placed a gentle hand on Tiana's shoulder, his touch a lifeline, the question wasn't whether consequences would commit, was how deep they'd cut. How much Grayson would lose when the system he leaned on turned its gaze upon him. Across the lot, a janitor paused mid-sweep, his broom stilled as he watched the standoff unfold. his weathered face creasing with a mix of worry and quiet outrage. A group of students lingered near a rusted bench, their whispers a soft buzz, some uneasy, others indignant, each a thread in the tapestry of a moment that would ripple outward. For Tiana, it was a lesson forged in fire, that power could bruise, but justice, wielded by those who understood its cost, could heal. For Grayson, it was the beginning of an unraveling, a stark reminder that the arrogance of unchecked authority carried a price he'd pay in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And for Malcolm, it was a father's vow made flesh. No force on earth would dim his daughter's light, not while he had breath to defend it. The afternoon sun hung low over the sprawling high school parking lot, its golden rays stretching across the asphalt like fingers trying to hold onto the fading day. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby oak trees, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic and the faint chatter of students spilling out of the building, their voices a mix of exhaustion and excitement as they headed home. For most, it was just another ordinary dismissal, a routine dance of cars pulling in and out, backpacks slung over shoulders, and farewells shouted across the lot. But for Tiana Brooks, a 14-year-old girl seated in her wheelchair at the edge of the pickup area, the air felt different today, heavier, tinged with an unease she couldn't quite place. Tiana adjusted her backpack on her lap, her fingers tracing the worn straps absent-mindedly. She was a girl of quiet strength, her dark eyes sharp with curiosity, and her mind always buzzing with ideas, dreams of Mars rovers and scientific breakthroughs that earned her the nickname Professor. Among her small circle of friends, her wheelchair, a constant companion since a childhood accident, was both a shield and a spotlight, marking her as different in a school where fitting in often felt like a survival skill. As a black teenager in a mostly white community, she'd grown used to the sit-along glances, the whispers that trailed her down the hallways. But Tiana carried herself with a resilience that refused to bow, her head held high even when the weight of the world pressed down. She glanced at her watch, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Her father, Malcolm Brooks, was Latin characteristically so. Malcolm was her rock, a towering figure whose steady presence could calm any storm. An FBI agent with years of experience under his belt, he moved through life with a quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. Tiana adored him not just for the badge he carried, but for the way he listened to her, the way he made her feel seen. Their evenings together at the kitchen table, swapping stories over cups of tea, were her sanctuary. She'd been eager to tell him about her latest science project today, a model rover she wanted his help building, but now she sat waiting, the minutes ticking by as the crowd around her thinned. The stillness of the moment shattered like glass when a shadow fell over her, abrupt and unwelcome. Tiana looked up, her breath catching as Officer Ethan Grayson loomed into view. He was a familiar figure round the school, though not a welcome one. In his late 30s, with a stocky build and a perpetual scowl etched into his weathered face, Ethan was the kind of man who wore his badge like a crown. His dark hair was cropped close, his uniform crisp, but there was something sloppy in the way he carried himself, a laziness masked by arrogance. To the students, he was a storm cloud on the horizon, a source of tension they avoided whenever they could. He didn't patrol the school out of any noble sense of duty. He was there because it was a playground for his ego, a place where his authority went unchallenged, or so he thought. "What are you doing here?" His voice sliced through the calm, rough and jagged, laced with a suspicion that made no sense to her. Tiana blinked, startled by the suddenness of his presence, her heart giving a quick, unsteady thud. She straightened in her chair, forcing her voice to stay even as she replied, "I'm just waiting for my dad to pick me up." It was a simple truth, offered with the polite respect she'd been taught to give, but Ethan's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened, his pale eyes narrowing as he took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the pavement with deliberate weight. He leaned in, his shadow swallowing the sunlight around her, and his tone grew colder, sharper, like a blade testing its edge. "Waiting? How'd sure about that?" The words dripped with disdain, each syllable a jab that seemed to question not just her explanation, but her right to be there at all. Tiana's pulse quickened, a drumbeat she couldn't silence, and her hands tightened around the armrests of her wheelchair until her knuckles ached. She didn't understand why he was doing this. Her mere existence seemed to offend him. But the hostility in his gaze was unmistakable, a mix of condescension and something uglier, something personal. "What's someone like you doing hanging around here?" he pressed, his voice rising as if her presence were a crime he'd caught her committing. The implication stung, a thinly veiled attack on everything she was: her race, her disability, her youth. Each word landed like a punch to her chest, bruising her pride, her dignity, her sense of self. She tried to fight back, her voice trembling but firm as she insisted, "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just waiting." But Ethan smirked, a cruel twist of his lips that deepened the pit in her stomach. He wasn't listening. It didn't want to. To him, she was a target, a chance to flex the power he clung to so tightly. A small crowd had begun to gather nearby, a handful of students and a teacher lingering at the edge of the scene. Their eyes darted between Tiana and Ethan, curiosity warring with unease. But no one stepped forward. Their silence hung heavy, a wall of indifference that left her feeling more alone than ever. She could sense their discomfort, the way they shifted their weight or looked away, unwilling to tangle with the officer who radiated intimidation like heat from a fire. Ethan thrived on that fear, fed off it, and Tiana could see it in the way he squared his shoulders, daring anyone to challenge him. Then he moved, his hand darting out to grip the handle of her wheelchair. He tilted it just slightly, just enough to make her feel the ground shift beneath her. It was a calculated move, subtle but vicious, a reminder of how little control she had in that moment. Tiana's breath caught, her body tensing as panic clawed its way up her throat. She gripped the armrests harder, fighting to stay steady, but the vulnerability crashed over her like a wave. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and insistent, but she blinked them back, refusing to let him see her break. She wouldn't give him that. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking despite her efforts, "you're scaring me." But Ethan only leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee and contempt as he muttered, "Don't play games with me." The threat in his tone was a weight pressing down on her, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, she wondered if this was how it would always be: powerless, exposed, at the mercy of someone who saw her as less than human. And then, like a beacon cutting through the fog, she heard the sound of a car engine. Her eyes flicked to the lot, and there he was, Malcolm Brooks, stepping out of his sleek black sedan with a presence that seemed to shift the very air around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark suit tailored to his frame, but it was his eyes that drew attention, sharp, piercing, taking in every detail of the scene before him. He didn't rush, didn't shout, but the way he moved was deliberate, each step a promise of reckoning. Tiana's chest flooded with relief, a lifeline pulling her from the depths of her fear. Her father was here, and that changed everything. Malcolm paused at the edge of the lot, his gaze sweeping over Ethan, then softening briefly as it landed on Tiana. He saw the tension in her posture, the way her hands gripped her chair, and something dark flickered in his expression, a storm gathering strength beneath his calm exterior. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying an authority that didn't need volume to command. "Let her go." Ethan froze, his hands still on the wheelchair, then turned slowly, sizing Malcolm up with a sneer. "And who are you supposed to be?" he shot back, his bravado a flimsy shield against the unease creeping into his gut. He didn't recognize the man standing before him, didn't see the danger in the quiet intensity of Malcolm's stare. To Ethan, this was just another parent, another annoyance to brush off. Malcolm didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You've made a mistake," he said, each word precise, heavy with meaning. "One you're going to answer for." Ethan's smirk faltered, a crack in his armor, but he rallied quickly, puffing out his chest. "Oh yeah, what are you gonna dockery to a lawyer? Good luck with that." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, but it didn't reach his eyes, which flickered with the first hint of doubt. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but his tone grew colder, a blade honed to a razor's edge. "I'm not here for lawsuits. I'm here to make sure you understand what happens when you abuse the power you think protects you." He stepped closer still, his presence towering, unyielding. "You picked the wrong girl to intimidate. She's stronger than you'll ever be. And she's got people who'll fight for her people. You can't scare off with a badge and a bad attitude." Ethan's grip on the wheelchair loosened, his confidence crumbling under the weight of Malcolm's words. He tried to hold his ground, but the air between them crackled with a tension he couldn't ignore. Tiana watched, her heart pounding, as her father stood like a wall between her and the man who'd tried to tear her down. The tears she'd fought so hard to hold back spilled over now, not from fear, but from a rush of gratitude, a fierce pride in the man who'd always been her protector. The crowd began to drift away, their curiosity sated, leaving Ethan standing alone as Malcolm gently guided Tiana toward the car. His hand rested on her shoulder, warm and steady, a silent promise that he wouldn't let this end here. Ethan watched them go, his jaw tight, still clinging to the belief that his badge would shield him. He'd walked away from worse, hadn't he? A slap on the wrist, a stern warning that's all this would be. But deep down, a seed of doubt took root, gnawing at his certainty. As they drove home, the car was a cocoon of silence, the hum of the engine, a steady backdrop to the chaos swirling in Tiana's mind. She stared out the window, the passing streets a blur of color she couldn't focus on. Her hands clutched her backpack, her knuckles pale from the pressure. As she replayed every second of the encounter, Ethan's sneering voice echoed in her ears, his rough grip on her chair a phantom weight that made her shiver. She'd never felt so small, so helpless, and the shame of it burned deep in her chest. But when she glanced at her father, she saw the storm in his ice anger. Yes, but also a fierce love that anchored her. Malcolm's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles taut, the veins in his temples pulsing with a fury he kept tightly leashed. He'd spent decades honing his composure, training himself to stay cool in the face of crisis interrogations, standoffs, high-stakes operations, but this was different. This wasn't just a case, it was his daughter, his heart, humiliated by a man who'd twisted the very system Malcolm had sworn to uphold. The badge Ethan wore was supposed to stand for justice, for protection, but he'd wielded it like a club, and that betrayal cut deeper than anything Malcolm had faced in the field. Tiana's voice broke the silence, soft but trembling with a mix of hurt and defiance. Why do people like him get to wear a badge? Why do they get to treat people like that and just walk away like it's nothing? Her words hung in the air, raw and searching, a plea for answers Malcolm wasn't sure he could give. He exhaled, a sharp, ragged sound, then his grip tightened until the leather of the steering wheel creaked. He wanted to tell her the world was fair, that justice always won, but he'd seen too much to lie. Instead, he met her gaze for a brief, intense moment, his eyes blazing with resolve. Because too many people let them, but not this time, Tiana, not with you. Her brow furrowed, confusion mixing with hope. What do you mean? She asked, her voice steadier now, curiosity edging out the fear. Malcolm's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. I mean, he messed with the wrong family. You didn't deserve a single second of what he did, and I'm going to make damn sure he learns what happens when you abuse power like that. There are consequences, and he's about to feel them. When they reached home, the house felt different, smaller, somehow, as if the weight of the day had pressed the walls inward. Malcolm tossed his keys onto the counter with a sharp clatter, his movements brisk as he pulled his phone from his pocket. Tiana lingered near the doorway, watching as he dialed number after number, his voice a low, controlled rumble as he spoke to colleagues, lawyers, officials' names she didn't know but whose importance she could sense. Each call was a thread in a web he was weaving, a plan taking shape with every word. She could see it in the way his shoulders squared, the way his pen tapped against the counter between calm mind at work, relentless and precise. Later that evening, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, his laptop glowing in the dim light, a notepad sprawled with scribbled notes beside it. Tiana hesitated in the doorway, the soft hum of her wheelchair's wheels announcing her presence. She wasn't sure if he wanted space, if this was his battle now, but he looked up and beckoned her over with a nod, his expression softening just enough to ease the knot in her chest. She rolled closer, the familiar creak of the floorboards grounding her, and stopped beside him. I need you to tell me everything, he said, his voice calm but firm, a quiet intensity underscoring every syllable. Every word he said, every move he made, didn't skip a thing. He held her gaze, his eyes searching hers, and she realized this wasn't just about facts, it was about trust. about giving her a voice in the fight ahead. Tiana took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap as she began. The words came haltingly at first, each memory a fresh wound she had to prod. But Malcolm didn't rush her. He listened, his pen scratching across the page, capturing every detailed sneer in Ethan's voice. The way his hand had jolted her chair, the crowd's silent stares. As she spoke, the fear loosened its grip, replaced by a flicker of something stronger. Anger, yes, but also determination. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was a stand against every time someone like Ethan had gotten away with it. Every time power had been used to crush instead of lift. When she finished, Malcolm set his pen down and leaned back, his silence a heavy thing, filled with the weight of what he'd heard. Then he reached out, his hand covering hers, warm and steady. "You're braver than he'll ever understand," he said, his voice thick with pride and pain. "And he's going to learn what happens when you try to break someone who's unbreakable." Tiana nodded, a lump rising in her throat. She didn't know what came next, how far her father would take this, how deep the consequences would cut, but she knew one thing. Ethan Grayson had underestimated them both. He'd seen her as weak, a girl in a chair he could push around. But he didn't know the strength she carried, forged in years of standing tall against a world that often tried to shrink her. And he didn't know Malcolm, a man who'd spent his life dismantling corruption, who'd turn over every stone to see justice done. As the days unfolded, Malcolm's plan took shape like a gathering storm. He dug into Ethan's past, uncovering a trail of complaints: students harassed, parents dismissed, incidents swept under the rug by a system too comfortable with its flaws. Ethan wasn't just a bad apple. He was a symptom, a man emboldened by years of unchecked power. But this time, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and Malcolm was the match to light the fuse. For Tiana, it was more than revenge. It was a lesson etched into her soul. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fight, a fire you stoked with every ounce of courage you had. And as she watched her father work, she felt that fire grow within her, a promise that she'd never let anyone make her feel small again. For Ethan, the consequences were coming, swift and unrelenting, a reckoning that would strip away the illusion of invincibility he'd clung to for so long. Power, he'd learn, was a fragile thing when built on sand, and justice, when it arrived, was a tide that spared no one. Malcolm's voice broke the heavy silence, carrying a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the dimly lit room. "This isn't just about what he did to you," he said, his tone low but firm, his eyes locking onto Tiana's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's about what he's likely done to countless others. People like him don't stumble into abusing their power overnight. It's a slow rot, a habit carved deep into their bones. We're going to dig until we find every last piece of it." Tiana's eyes widened, a flicker of shock dancing across her face as the gravity of his words sank in. Her fingers tightened around the armrests of her wheelchair, the cool metal grounding her as her mind raced. "You really think he's hurt others before?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, a mix of fear and curiosity threading through it. Malcolm nodded, his jaw set with grim certainty. "I'd bet my life on it, and if we can prove it, he won't just lose that shiny badge he hides behind, he'll lose everything. He's built on the backs of people he thought no one would defend." The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet determination. Malcolm threw himself into the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. His broad shoulders hunched over stacks of files late into the night, the faint glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He reached out to old colleagues, men and women he'd known for years, people whose moral compasses he trusted implicitly. They were the kind who understood that justice wasn't just a word thrown around in courtrooms. It was a promise that had to be fought for, especially when the system turned a blind eye. Together, they sifted through dusty records, chasing down every whisper of a complaint against Officer Ethan Grayson. What they uncovered wasn't just a single bad apple, it was a festering wound. Page after page revealed a trail of misconduct, excessive force that left bruises on more than just bodies, racial profiling that turned routine stops into nightmares, false arrests that stole time and dignity from the innocent. Each report was a brushstroke in a portrait of a man who'd been cradled by a system too comfortable with its own flaws. Malcolm's hands trembled with barely contained rage as he read, the realization dawning that this wasn't just one corrupt cop, it was a culture that let predators like Ethan thrive. Their abuses swept under the rug with a wink and a handshake. The deeper he dug, the more his frustration morphed into a steely resolve. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a reckoning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Malcolm sat at his cluttered desk, surrounded by a sea of papers and empty coffee mugs. The faint hum of the city filtered through the open window, a distant reminder of the world still turning outside his mission. Tiana rolled into the room, her wheelchair creaking softly against the hardwood floor, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Dad," she began, her voice hesitant, laced with a nervousness that made Malcolm's head snap up. "I think I've got something that might help." She extended the phone toward him, her fingers trembling slightly, and as he took it, his breath caught in his throat. The video she'd secretly recorded during her confrontation with Ethan flickered to life on the small screen. It wasn't long, just a handful of seconds, but it was a thunderclap in its clarity. Ethan's voice boomed through the tinny speaker, sharp and venomous, his words dripping with a hostility that made Malcolm's blood run cold. The footage captured his towering figure, his movements aggressive and unapologetic, a stark display of power wielded without restraint. Malcolm's chest swelled with a fierce pride as he looked at his daughter, her courage shining through the fear in her eyes. "This is it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, a rare crack in his usually unshakable demeanor. "This is the key we've been waiting for." Malcolm knew this fight couldn't be waged alone. He turned to the community, those tireless souls who'd been shouting into the void about police accountability long before Tiana's run-in with Ethan. They were a patchwork of voices, a middle-aged woman with weary eyes who'd lost her son to a trigger-happy cop, a young activist with a megaphone and a fire in his belly, an elderly man whose quiet dignity masked decades of endured injustice. Together, they wove a tapestry of testimonies, each story a thread that tightened the noose round Ethan's neck. Slowly, a chilling pattern emerged, names and dates that echoed Tiana's experience, lives upended by the same arrogant hand. Meanwhile, Ethan strutted through his days like a king, untouchable, his badge gleaming under the precinct's fluorescent lights. He laughed off the rumors swirling around him, whispers of an investigation that reached beyond the precinct walls, tendrils curling toward places he'd never thought vulnerable. At first, he brushed them aside with a smirk, his confidence unshaken, but as the days stretched on, a gnawing unease began to coil in his gut, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. The tension built like a storm gathering on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in with a promise of upheaval. Malcolm prepared relentlessly, his mind a steel trap, every detail catalogued and ready to strike. He knew taking down Ethan wouldn't be a clean victory. Men like him clung to power with desperate, dirty hands, but retreat wasn't an option. Too much hung in the balance: Tiana's dignity, the silenced cries of Ethan's other victims, the fragile hope of a justice system that might still be forced to bend toward right. One quiet evening, as the living room glowed softly with the flicker of a single lamp, Tiana looked up at her father from her spot on the couch. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked, her voice small but steady, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "Do you think we can really stop him?" Malcolm knelt beside her, resting a warm, steady hand on her shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "It's not about whether it'll work," he said, his words deliberate, each one a vow etched into the air between them. "It's about making damn sure he can't hurt anyone else. And we're going to see this through, no matter what it takes." The promise lingered, heavy and unshakable, a beacon in the uncertainty ahead. Neither of them could foresee the labyrinth of revelations waiting around the corner. But as the pieces of their case slotted into place, one truth gleamed brighter than the rest: Ethan Grayson's reign was crumbling, and the fallout would be a tempest he'd never braced for. The hearing room was a study in understated ordinariness by walls that swallowed sound. Rows of stiff chairs lined up like silent witnesses, a space meant to exude impartiality. But the air inside crackled with a tension so thick it seemed to hum. Tiana sat near the front, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles paled, her wheelchair positioned close to the table where Malcolm anchored himself beside her. He wore a dark suit, crisp and unyielding, his FBI badge tucked away in his pocket like a hidden blade. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury, a fire stoked by weeks of sleepless nights and unyielding purpose. He'd poured himself into this moment, every scrap of evidence, every victim's trembling voice, every damning detail woven into a net so tight Ethan couldn't slip through. Across the room, Ethan sat rigid, his broad frame taut with defiance, his jaw locked as if he could grit his teeth hard enough to make the accusations vanish. His attorney, a weary man with silver-streaked hair and a voice like polished glass, leaned in to murmur something, but Ethan's gaze never wavered from Malcolm. To him, this wasn't justicide, it was a personal war, a direct assault on the throne he'd built from years of unchecked dominance. The proceedings crawled forward with a maddening slowness, a parade of formalities that stretched nerves to breaking points. Malcolm's jaw tightened as Ethan's attorney spun a tale of misinterpretation, his words slithering through the room like oil, painting Ethan as a misunderstood servant of the law. It was a flimsy shield, and Malcolm knew it wouldn't hold, not against the arsenal he'd brought. When his turn came, he rose, his presence filling the space like a storm about to break. His voice was steady, measured, but it carried an edge that sliced through the room's stale air. He began with Tiana's story, painting the scene with vivid strokes: the school hallway, the sharp bark of Ethan's voice, the way his shadow loomed over her wheelchair, stripping away her sense of safety with every sneered word. Tiana listened, her chest tightening as the memory clawed its way back. But her father's voice was an anchor, pulling her through the flood of emotion. He didn't just recount the facts, yet bared the raw humanity of it, the fear that had gripped her, the humiliation that had lingered long after Ethan walked away. Then came the video. As the footage played, the room fell into a stunned hush, the only sound Ethan's recorded voice, sharp, cruel, dripping with a disdain that made the walls themselves seem to recoil. His actions unfolded in grainy clarity, a snapshot of arrogance so blatant it defied excuse. Malcolm watched the room shift, brows furrowing, shoulders stiffening, a quiet anger rippling through the onlookers like a tide. When it ended, Ethan's attorney leapt up, his voice shrill as he tried to claw back control, claiming the clip was out of context, a distorted fragment of a bigger picture. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience fraying, but his resolve unyielding. He was ready for the next blow. The cross-examination was a slow, deliberate dismantling. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting as he faced Ethan directly. He started with the complaints, each one a name, a date, a wound reopened with surgical precision. Ethan squirmed, his answers slippery at first, coated in vague denials, but Malcolm pressed harder, his questions relentless. He brought up a young man stopped for no reason, left bruised and shaken, a mother whose cries for help were met with handcuffs, an elderly shopkeeper falsely accused. His trust in the law shattered. Tiana watched, her heart thundering, as her father peeled back Ethan's mask layer by layer. She'd always known he was skilled, but this was something else, a master at work, his words hammering nails into the coffin of Ethan's crumbling empire. The climax came when Malcolm slid a thick file across the table, its pages heavy with weeks of painstaking labor. "This," he said, his voice steady but resonant, "is the truth you can't bury." Inside were records of misconduct, sworn statements from victims, a catalog of abuses that stretched back years, a pattern so clear it screamed for accountability. Ethan's attorney sputtered, grasping for objections, but Malcolm's presence drowned him out. He turned to Ethan, his gaze a blade. "How many times have you done this?" he asked, his voice rising just enough to seize the room. "How many lives have you broken, thinking no one would dare hold you to account?" The question hung there, unanswered but deafening, a mirror held up to a man who'd mistaken power for invincibility. In that moment, the lesson was stark. Justice, when wielded with unwavering hands, could topple even the most entrenched, transcend the consequences of abusing power. Were a tide Ethan could no longer outrun. The air in the cramped hearing room buzzed with an electric tension, thick enough to choke on. As Ethan Grayson sat rigid in his chair, his badge, once a gleaming symbol of authority he wielded like a club, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He'd used it countless times to crush the voices of those too powerless to push back people. whose only crime was crossing his path when he felt like flexing his control. How many had he left humiliated, their dignity trampled under his boots, knowing they couldn't do a damn thing about it? The thought gnawed at him now, not out of guilt, but because the walls he'd built with that power were starting to cave in. His composure, usually an iron mask, was fracturing. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, his jaw clenched so tight it might snap. When he spoke, his voice came out in sharp, jagged bursts, defensive little stabs at justification that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I was doing my job," he snapped, the words clipped and brittle. "You don't get it. You weren't there." But the evidence stacked against him was a mountain too steep to climb, each piece a glaring spotlight on the truth he'd spent years dodging. Across the room, Malcolm stood like a storm waiting to break, his presence steady but charged with purpose. He didn't flinch as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on Ethan with a piercing intensity that cut through the officer's crumbling bravado. His voice was low and razor-sharp, every syllable a hammer striking stone. "You really thought this could go on forever, didn't you? That you could keep stomping on people, hiding behind that badge, and no one would ever call you out. But today's the day you learn something. Ethan Power doesn't make you untouchable. Actions have consequences, and yours have finally caught up." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the silence that followed. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Malcolm's accusation settling over everyone like a dense fog. Ethan shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching against the table, his once kosher demeanor unraveling thread by thread. For the first time, he looked small, cornered, a man who'd mistaken fear for respect and was only now seeing the difference. Tiana sat beside her father, her heart pounding so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as she fought to steady herself. Every glance at Ethan sent a jolt through her ranger, fear, and something new flickering to life, hope. She'd spent so long feeling powerless under his shadow, but now, watching him squirm, she felt the faintest spark of possibility. Justice, that elusive thing she'd almost given up on, seemed to hover just within reach. As the hearing stretched on, the tension thickened, each new revelation peeling back another layer of Ethan's carefully constructed facade. Tiana stole a look at Malcolm, her chest swelling with a fierce pride. He wasn't just fighting for her, was fighting for every soul Ethan had silenced, every life he'd diminished with his unchecked arrogance. His resolve was a lifeline, and she clung to it as the proceedings barreled toward their end. By the time the gavel signaled a break, one truth stood stark and undeniable: Ethan Grayson's reign of terror was teetering on the edge of collapse. But the real reckoning, the full measure of what he'd face, was still lurking just out of sight. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with anticipation and the ghosts of past wrongs. Malcolm remained a pillar of calm, his face a mask of quiet determination, but inside, his mind churned like a tempest. He'd laid out the evidence with surgical precision: every incident, every abuse of power, every tear shed because of Ethan's cruelty. The bully who'd cloaked himself in authority had been stripped bare, exposed for what he was. Yet Malcolm knew the battle wasn't over. The next phase would be the crucible, the moment that decided not just Tiana's fate, but the fates of all those who'd suffered in silence under Ethan's tyranny. This wasn't just about holding one man accountable, it was about carving a lesson into the world. No badge, no title, no wall of power could shield you from justice forever. The thought fueled him, steadying his hands as he prepared for what came next. Tiana, seated at his side, felt her breath catch with every passing second. Her fingers dug into the table's edge, her nails leaving faint crescent marks in the wood. She tried to slow her racing pulse, but Ethan's presence across the room was a magnet for her gaze. He sat there, his face a fortress of defiance, but his iced host cold. Calculating ice flickered with something unsteady, doubt, maybe fear even. The cracks in his armor were widening, and Tiana could see them spreading. His attorney, a weary man with a pinched face, leaned in close, whispering frantically in a last-ditch effort to shore up his client's defenses. Ethan didn't answer, didn't even nod. His focus was locked on Malcolm, the man dismantling his world piece by piece. He was losing grip, and the realization was sinking in slow and cold, like water seeping through a sinking ship. The judge's voice cut through the room, firm and unyielding. As she announced the next phase, the testimonies, Malcolm had been waiting for this, his chest tightening with a mix of dread and resolve. He rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He'd called witness ordinary people whose lives Ethan had trampled, and each one carried a shard of the truth that would bury him. First up was a young man, barely 20, with a mop of dark hair and eyes that darted nervously round the room. His name was Javier, and as he took the stand, his hands shook, gripping the edge until his knuckles turned pale. His voice trembled as he began, recounting a day that had haunted him for months. "I was just walking home," he said, his words halting, fragile. Ethan pulled up in his cruiser, told me I looked suspicious. I said I hadn't done anything, but he didn't care. He slammed me against the car, called me trash, said my kind didn't belong here. When I tried to explain, he shoved me harder, told me to shut my mouth. As Javier spoke, the tremor in his voice gave way to a raw, burning anger, his story spilling out like a wound finally lanced. Malcolm watched Ethan closely. The officer's jaw tightened, his fists balling under the table. But he stayed silent, pinned by the weight of the boy's words. Next came a woman named Marisol, her voice quaking as she clutched a tissue in her hands. She was a mother of 2, her dark hair streaked with gray, and the memory she shared was still fresh enough to sting. "He pulled me over on my way home from work," she said, her eyes glistening. "No reason, no ticket, just said I looked like trouble. He made me get out. Searched me right there on the street while my kids watched from the car, crying. People drove by, staring, and he just laughed. Told me I should be grateful he didn't take me in." Her shame and fury wove together, her words painting a vivid picture of a woman stripped of her dignity for no reason but Ethan's whim. Then there was Mr. Henderson, an older man with a weathered face and a quiet strength. His voice was steady, but the rage simmered beneath it as he described Ethan harassing him in his own neighborhood. "I've lived there 40 years, he said, his hands clasped tight. "He stopped me one night, said I didn't look right walking my own street. Treated me like some crook, all because he could." Each testimony was a brick in the wall closing around Ethan, and with every story, he seemed to shrink, his attorney's objections growing feebler, his defiance fading into desperation. The room shifted, the balance tipping toward truth as the voices of the silenced rose up. Tiana felt a surge of something powerful, yes, but also solidarity. These were her people, strangers bound to her by shared pain, and now they were speaking, their words a chorus of defiance. When her turn came, the silence was deafening. Every eye fixed on her as she wheeled herself to the stand. Her heart thundered, a wild drumbeat in her chest, and her hands trembled as they gripped the arms of her chair. She took a shaky breath, glancing at Malcolm, who gave her a nod, steady, proud, unwavering. It anchored her. Her voice started soft, a whisper against the stillness, but it grew, gaining strength like a river carving its path. "That day," she began, her eyes locking onto Ethan's, "you came at me like I was nothing. You sneered, told me I didn't belong, that I was in your way. You used your words like weapons, made me feel small, scared, worthless. I've carried that fear ever since, that anger. But I'm here now, and you don't get to decide what I'm worth." Her voice broke at times, tears brimming, but she pressed on, her gaze never wavering. "You looked at me like I wasn't human, but I am. I belong, and you can't take that from me." The silence that followed was profound, her words a heavy shroud over the room. Even the judge paused, her stern face softening for a fleeting moment. Malcolm's pride was a quiet fire in his chest as he watched his daughter brave, fierce, unbreakable. Ethan's attorney leapt up, scrambling to poke holes in the testimonies, to spin Ethan as a misunderstood hero. But the evidence was a tidal wave, the voices of the wronged a force too strong to drown out. As the final arguments unfolded, Malcolm leaned close to Tiana, his voice a soft rumble. "No matter what happens, you were incredible today. You stood up for yourself, for them. That's what counts." She nodded, tears spilling over, but there was more she wanted. Justice, accountability, something real to mend the wounds Ethan had left behind. The judge's voice rang out at last, clear and final, cutting through the tension like a blade. Ethan Grayson would pay his badge stripped, his actions laid bare, his power dissolved. The system that had propped him up had finally turned, holding him to the fire of his own making. As the room began to clear, Tiana turned to Malcolm, her voice trembling but alive with feeling. "We did it," she whispered, the words fragile but fierce. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his face softening with a rare tenderness. "No," he said, firm and sure, "you did it. You showed them who you are, and that's something no one can ever take away." She smiled through her tears, the weight of victory settling over her like a warm blanket. It wasn't just justice, it was a triumph that echoed beyond the room. A lesson etched in the ruins of Ethan's downfall. Power abused would always meet its end, and those it sought to crush could rise stronger than ever. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a stillness that hummed with the day's gravity. Tiana and Malcolm lingered at the table, the echoes of the judge's ruling still ringing in their ears. Ethan had been let out through a side door, his head bowed, his once proud stride reduced to a shuffle. Shock and fury warred across his face, but he hadn't dared meet their eyes. It didn't matter. His reckoning had come, and for once, he was powerless to stop it. As they sat there, absorbing the quiet, Tiana felt something shift inside her, a release, a lightness. She'd faced the man who'd tried to break her, and she'd won, not just for herself, but for Javier, Marisol, Mr. Henderson, and every name she'd never know. The lesson was clear, searing. Justice might bend, might falter, but it could still strike true. And when it did, it left no room for the corrupt to hide. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood echoing faintly in the dimly lit room. His fingers, calloused from years of labor and resolve, rushed along the frayed edge of a document sprawled across the table. The paper felt heavy under his touch, as though it carried the weight of every word written on its testimonies, accusations, and the hard-earned verdict that had finally come to pass. His sharp, watchful eyes, once bright with unyielding determination, now bore the faint shadow of exhaustion. Yet beneath that weariness, a quiet fire still flickered, refusing to be extinguished by the long battle they'd endured. Across from him sat Tiana, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the room. Her lips were pressed into a tight, thin line, a stark contrast to the softness her face used to hold. She seemed older now, as if the ordeal had peeled away a layer of her youth and replaced it with something denser, grief, perhaps, or a bitter understanding of the world's imperfections. Her hands rested in her lap, clutching her phone so tightly that her knuckles paled against her skin. The ride home had been suffocating, not from a lack of words, but from an overflow of them, too tangled and raw to escape their lips. The silence stretched between them like a vast, uncharted sea, each lost in their own storm of thoughts. Tiana's mind churned relentlessly, replaying the day's events in vivid, unrelenting detail, trembling voices of the witnesses, the mountain of evidence that had buried their adversary, and the judge's gavel striking down with a finality that should have felt like victory. Justice had been served, a sentence handed down to Ethan, the man whose arrogance and cruelty had scarred so many lives. But the triumph she'd once imagined bright, cleansing, and complet felt hollow now, a distant echo of what she'd hoped for. Her chest tightened as she turned to her father, her voice barely breaking the stillness. "Dad," she murmured, the word fragile against the weight of her thoughts. "Do you think he'll ever really get it? What he did to all those people? Or is he just mad he got caught?" Malcolm's hands tightened around the steering wheel, the leather creaking under his grip as his knuckles blanched white. He let out a slow, deliberate breath, the sound heavy with the burden of years spent wrestling with questions like hers. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, the city's lights casting fleeting shadows across his weathered face. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, but laced with a quiet weariness that betrayed his fatigue. "Some people never see it, Tiana," he said, each word chosen with care. "They don't want to. For them, it's not about what's right or wrong, it's about holding power, bending the world to their will. Losing that control is the only thing that cuts deep enough to make them feel anything." Tiana turned her head, her eyes tracing the golden streaks of city lights blurring past the window against the deepening twilight. The beauty of it felt distant, unreachable. "It's not enough," she whispered, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the hum of the engine. I thought once he was held accountable, it'd fix something, make everything okay again. But it doesn't. He hurt so many people, Dad, and nothing we do can undo that." Her words hung in the air, heavy with disappointment and a dawning realization that justice, while necessary, couldn't heal the wounds it sought to avenge. Malcolm stole a glance at her, his stern features softening as he caught the flicker of pain in her eyes. "You're right," he said quietly, his tone gentle but firm. "It doesn't erase what he did. Nothing can, but it stops him from hurting anyone else. And sometimes, Tiana, that's the best we can hope for, the only piece of this mess we can hold on to." His words were a lifeline, simple yet profound, pulling her back from the edge of despair. The days that followed blurred into a haze of noise and motion. The case had erupted into something far bigger than they'd anticipated, drawing the eyes of the world to their small corner of it. News vans lined the streets outside their home, their satellite dishes piercing the sky like jagged teeth. Reporters dissected every moment of the trial, replaying snippets of the video Tiana had captured, her voice quivering yet resolute, as she confronted Ethan, the man who'd wielded his badge like a weapon. The footage looped endlessly on screens across the city, her standing tall, her phone trembling in her hands, her defiance cutting through his threats like a blade. Activists hailed her as a hero, a beacon of courage in a world too often shrouded in silence. Strangers flooded her social media with messages of gratitude, their words a soothing balm against the raw ache that still gnawed at her heart. But with the praise came the venom. Faceless voices crawled out from the shadows of the internet, spewing hatred and denial in equal measure. They called her a liar, a traitor, their words dripping with malice as they defended Ethan's actions, dismissing the suffering he'd caused as if it were a fleeting inconvenience. Tiana scrolled through the comments at first, her stomach twisting with each cruel jab, until Malcolm caught her mid-spiral. "Don't," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the fog of her thoughts as he plucked the phone from her hands and set it face down on the table. "They don't get to have your energy, Tiana. Their poison doesn't define you. It doesn't even deserve a corner of your mind." His tone was firm, protective, but beneath it lay a quiet plea for her to shield herself from a world that too often rewarded cruelty with loyalty. She nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears, but the sting of those words lingered like a bruise she couldn't ignore. How could anyone defend him? How could they look at the lives he'd shattered, families torn apart? Trust Ero deadened, call it nothing? The question gnawed at her, a relentless thread tugging at the edges of her resolve, threatening to unravel the fragile piece she'd begun to stitch together. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the room in hues of amber, the phone rang. Slicing through the stillness, Malcolm answered, his posture stiffening as the voice on the other end a federal prosecutor he'd known for years delivered news that shifted the ground beneath them. The man's tone was calm but urgent, each word a pebble dropped into a still pond, rippling outward with implications too vast to grasp at once. The investigation into Ethan had peeled back a single layer only to reveal a festering wound beneath a sprawling network of officers within his department. Bound together by a shared code of corruption, they'd shielded one another, burying complaints and weaving a tapestry of lies to protect their own. Ethan, it turned out, was merely a symptom of a far deeper sickness. Malcolm listened in silence, his jaw clenching tighter with every detail, his free hand curling into a fist against the armrest. When the call ended, he sat motionless, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like a physical force. He'd long suspected that Ethan wasn't an outlier, that his abuse of power was nurtured by a culture that thrived in the shadows of the precinct. But to hear it confirmed to know that the rot ran so deep shook him in a way he hadn't expected. Tiana approached cautiously, her wheelchair gliding silently across the hardwood floor. She could sense the storm brewing in him, the shift in his demeanor as palpable as the air before a downpour. "Dad," she asked, her voice tentative, "what's wrong?" He met her gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable, the lines on his face etched deeper by the burden he carried. "This isn't over," he said simply, his voice low and resolute. "Ethan wasn't alone. There are others more of the man, and now we've got a chance to drag them all into the light." The gravity of his words settled between them, a shared realization of the mountain that loomed ahead. Tiana's heart stuttered, torn between relief that justice might reach further and exhaustion at the thought of waiting. Deeper into the fight, she'd thought they were nearing the finish line, a chance to breathe. But now it felt like they'd only crossed the threshold into a war they hadn't signed up for. In the days that followed, Malcolm threw himself into the fray with a ferocity that both inspired and worried her. He spent hours hunched over his desk, papers strewn about like fallen leaves, his pen scratching notes as he coordinated with the prosecutor and federal agents. The investigation swelled, unearthing a trail of corruption that snaked through the department's highest ranks. Each name exposed felt like a small triumph, a crack in the fortress of impunity that had stood for too long. Yet with every victory came the sobering truth. For every officer unmasked, there were countless victims whose voices had been smothered, their stories entombed in a system built to shield its own. Tiana watched him from the doorway one evening, the lamplight casting long shadows across his tired frame. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, his movements sluggish as he sifted through yet another stack of files. She admired his tenacity, the way he pressed forward when others might have crumbled. But it gnawed at her to see him fraying at the edges. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but insistent as she rolled closer. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" Her eyes searched his, pleading for a glimpse into the man beneath the armor. Malcolm looked up, his expression softening as he leaned back in his chair, hands resting on the desk's edge. "Every day," he admitted, the confession raw and unguarded. "But I keep going because I know what's on the line. If I stop, who's going to stand up? I do it for you, Tina, for a world where people like Ethan don't get to decide who's worthy of justice and who isn't." His words struck her like a chord, resonating deep within her chest. She nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "I want that too," she whispered. "But sometimes it feels so huge, like we'll never win." He reached out, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. "It won't always feel that way," he said gently. "Change is slow, and it's hard. But it starts with people like you, people who stand up when it counts. You did that, Tiana. You lit the spark." His voice carried a quiet pride, a reminder of the strength she'd summoned when the world demanded she stay silent. She felt a thin flicker of purpose reigniting within her, a resolve to see this through, no matter how daunting the road ahead. As they braced for the next chapter, the battle loomed large, its shadow stretching across their lives. But for the first time, Tiana sensed they weren't alone. The cracks in the system were widening, and through them, the faint glow of accountability began to pierce the darkness. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a gavel's folie, it was a relentless pursuit, a refusal to let power go unchecked. And the consequences of that power, when abused, rippled far beyond the hands that wielded it, leaving a legacy of pain that demanded to be confronted, no matter the cost. Malcolm's voice carried a quiet steadiness as he spoke, though beneath it surged a current of raw emotion that he could barely contain. "Normal wasn't good enough," he said, his words deliberate, heavy with the weight of years spent wrestling with a truth he could no longer ignore. Normal is the trap that let people like Ethan Grayson walk free, year after year, their hands stained with wrongs no one dared to call out. Normal is the gag that chokes voices, the shadow that convinces people they're powerless against what's broken. We can't let ourselves slip back into that. His eyes, dark and resolute, flickered with a fire born of frustration and unyielding hope. Tiana sat across from him, her gaze drifting to the window, where the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the worn wooden floor of their living room. Her hands twisted restlessly in her lap, fingers threading and unthreading as if trying to unravel the knot of feelings coiled tight inside her. "I know," she murmured, her voice so soft it barely broke the stillness. "But sometimes it feels like too much, like no matter how hard we push, it'll never be enough to fix anything." The admission hung between them, fragile and honest, a confession she hadn't meant to let slip but couldn't hold back. Malcolm's heart ached at the sound of her doubt, a pang that rippled through him as he watched his daughter grapple with the enormity of their fight. He leaned forward, his calloused hand finding her shoulder, its warmth a steady anchor against the storm brewing in her mind. "It's never too much when it's right," he said, his tone firm yet tender, laced with a conviction that had carried him through battles she couldn't yet fathom. I get it, it's exhausting, Tiana. It feels like we're swinging at shadows, like every punch we throw lands on empty air. But every step we take, every word we shout, it chips away at the wall they've built to hide the truth. And you've been braver than anyone I've ever known. You've stared down things no one your age should have to. And you've done it with a strength that humbles me every single day. Tiana's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the sting of them prickling at the edges of her vision. She blinked hard, refusing to let them spill, her jaw tightening as she fought to hold herself together. She lifted her gaze to meet her father's, searching his face for the certainty she so desperately needed. "Do you really think they'll change anything?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though it trembled with the weight of her question. "The system, I mean. Do you think it's even possible?" The words carried her hope and her fear in equal measure, a plea for reassurance in a world that had taught her to expect disappointment. Malcolm let out a long, weary sigh, his brow creasing as he turned her question over in his mind. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Change is slow," he admitted, his voice rough with the truth he'd learned through decades of watching justice bend and break. "It's messy, and it fights you every step of the way. But I've seen it happen, Tiana. I've watched laws shift, seen people rise up and demand something better than what they were given. I've felt the ground shake when enough voices refuse to be silenced. It's not easy, and it's not fast, but it's possible. As long as we keep pushing, as long as we don't let them bury this, we can make it real." His words settled over her like a thick wool blanket, heavy with responsibility, but warm with promise, wrapping her in the quiet strength of his belief. Tiana nodded, her resolve hardening like steel forged in fire. She didn't have all the answers, maybe she never would, but she knew. She couldn't let the crushing weight of it all smother her spirit. She had to keep going, not just for herself but for the countless others whose voices had been stolen by fear and indifference. Malcolm rose from his seat, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading out to his meeting, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers scrolling through a flood of messages that had poured in over the past weeks. Some were kind, brimming with support and gratitude, lifting her spirits with their sincerity. Others were sharp-edged, venomous jabs from strangers who refused to see the truth or blamed her for daring to stir the waters. Each cruel word stung, a needle pricked to her pride. But she clung to her father's words like a lifeline. These voices didn't define her, and they didn't deserve the energy it would take to hate them. Hours later, the front door creaked open, and Malcolm stepped back into the house, his broad frame sagging with exhaustion, yet lit by a faint spark of triumph. Tiana wheeled herself into the kitchen, her curiosity ignited by the subtle curve of a smile, tugging at his lips, a rare sight these days. "What happened?" she asked, her voice bright with a tentative hope that bubbled up despite her efforts to tamp it down. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, his dark eyes meeting hers with a gleam of hard-won satisfaction. "We've got enough to move forward," he said, his tone steady but alive with purpose. "The evidence against Ethan's department, it's overwhelming. The corruption's not just a thread, it's a whole damn web. We've traced it back to the key players, the ones who propped him up, who swept his dirt under the rug, who built a system where abuse wasn't just ignored, but protected." Tiana's chest swelled with pride, a fierce, glowing thing that warred with the sobering weight of his words. She could feel the enormity of it pressing down on her, the lives ruined, the trust shattered, all because of a handful of people who'd twisted power into a weapon. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile possibility unfolding before them. Malcolm exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over his face, the lines of fatigue etched deeper in the dim kitchen light. "Now it's up to the prosecutors," he said. "They're building a case, lining up charges against everyone tangled in this mess. It's going to be a long haul, months, maybe years, but it's a start." The air between them thickened with the gravity of that truth, a bittersweet blend of hope and the daunting road stretching out ahead. Tiana's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling to the people who'd stepped forward, their trembling voices breaking years of silence at the hearings. She pictured their face lined with pain, hardened by betrayal, yet alive with a defiance that mirrored her own. This fight was for them, too, for every soul who'd suffered under the same corrupt shadow. As the weeks unfurled, the investigation snowballed into a national spectacle. Television screens blazed with headlines, reporters dissecting the scandal with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Athens' department, once a faceless monolith, was laid bare, its rot exposed for all to see. Protests erupted across the city, a sea of signs and voices swelling in the streets, demanding accountability, screaming for a system that didn't shield the guilty. Tiana watched it all unfold from the safety of her living room, her breath catching at the sheer scale of it. She'd never dreamed her story, her small, trembling spark would ignite something so vast, so unstoppable. One evening, as the sky outside deepened to a bruised purple, Malcolm sank onto the couch beside her, his presence a steady comfort in the chaos. His face was serious, but his eyes held a warmth that softened the edges of his exhaustion. "You've done something incredible, Tiana," he said, his voice low and rich with pride. "You've shown people they don't have to swallow injustice whole, that their voices can crack the silence wide open. Because of you, because of your courage, they're finally listening." Tiana turned to him, her eyes glistening with a rush of emotion she couldn't name. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly, her words trembling with gratitude. "You believed in me even when I was too scared to believe in myself." He smiled, a rare, full smile that lit up his weary face, and reached for her hand. "That's what family does," he said simply. "We hold each other up, no matter how heavy it gets." Their words lingered in the air, a quiet testament to the bond that had carried them through the fire. The fight was far from finished. Justice, they both knew, was a stubborn, elusive thing, but for the first time, Tiana felt the tide shifting beneath them. They were on the right side of it, pushing toward a future where power couldn't silence truth, where the consequences of corruption would finally catch up to those who'd wielded it so recklessly. As they sat there, side by side, a flicker of hope stirred in her chest, fragile but fierce, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the world could bend toward something better. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind, a relentless cascade of revelations that shook the ground beneath their feet. The federal investigation roared to life, peeling back layer after layer of Athens' department until the full scope of its decay lay bare. Names and faces flashed across news channels, officers, administrators, bureaucrats. One a cog in the machine that had sheltered Athens' abuses for years. It was staggering, almost incomprehensible, to think of how many had turned a blind eye, how many had traded their integrity for a paycheck or a pat on the back. Every choice they'd made, every secret they'd buried, had fueled a culture where fear thrived and justice suffocated. Tiana often found herself perched on the edge of the couch, the television's glow painting her face in shifting hues of blue and gold. Pride swelled in her chest as she watched the world take notice, but it was laced with a deep, aching sadness for the lives that had been trampled under this broken system. Lives her father had spent his career trying to protect. She thought of the witnesses who'd testified, their voices raw with years of bottled-up pain, their eyes glinting with a defiance that echoed her own. There was Maria, a middle-aged woman with a sharp tongue and a spine of steel, who'd lost her son to the department's brutality and refused to let his story die. And James, a soft-spoken mechanic whose hands shook as he recounted years of harassment, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the chaos around him. These were the people who'd given her fight its heartbeat, and she carried their stories like a torch. One night, as the television hummed with the day's latest updates, Malcolm trudged through the door, a stack of papers tucked under his arm and exhaustion carved into every line of his body. He dropped the files onto the dining table with a muted thud and sank into a chair, rubbing his temples as if he could knead away the weight of the day. Tiana wheeled closer, her brow furrowing with concern. "You've been going non-stop," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to rest, Dad. You can't keep running on empty like this." He looked up at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No time for that, sweetheart," he said, his tone resolute. "We're in the thick of it now. This could change everything. I'll rest when it's done." Tiana's frown deepened, her hands tightening on the wheels of her chair as she studied him. "What if when it's done never comes?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if you burn out before we get there? You're always telling me to take care of myself, but you're not listening to your own advice." Her words hit him like a gust of cold wind, stripping away the armor he'd built around his resolve. He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight, and let out a breath that seemed to carry the exhaustion of a lifetime. She was writhed, couldn't deny it. The past months had been a relentless siege, each day chipping away at his strength. But every time he thought of stepping back, the faces of the betrayed flashed before him. It wasn't just Tiana he was fighting for, it was Maria, James, and every soul the system had crushed under its heel. "I hear you," he said at last, his voice softening with a rare vulnerability. "But I can't stop now. Not when we're this close. If we don't see this through, it could all unravel. And I can't let that happen, not after everything we've given." Tiana's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers clenching as a tremor of worry rippled through her. "I just don't want to lose you to this," she said, her voice breaking. "You've already given so much, you don't want it to take everything." Malcolm reached out, his hand finding her shoulder again, its weight a promise he meant to keep. "You won't lose me," he said, his tone fierce with determination. "I swear it. But I need you to trust me, Tiana. This is bigger than you. It's about making sure no one else has to endure what you did. It's about dragging the truth into the light and holding them accountable for every ounce of pain they've caused. That's worth every fight." Tiana nodded, her worry still a quiet ache in her chest, but she understood. Her father's heart was a fortress of resolve, and he'd pour every last drop of himself into this battle, not because he wanted glory, but because he believed justice was a debt the world owed its wounded. She saw it in the way his shoulders squared, in the fire that still burned behind his tired eyes. This fight had become a reckoning, a lesson carved in the scars of those who'd suffered, a warning that power, when twisted, would one day face its consequences. And as they braced for the next chapter, Tiana clung to that flicker of hope, trusting that their voices, woven together, could finally tip the scales. Tiana had always been captivated by the fire that burned within her father, Malcolm's relentless drive to seek truth and right the wrongs of a world that often seemed indifferent. It was a quality she cherished deeply, one that filled her with admiration every time she watched him pore over case files, late into the night, or speak with unwavering conviction to those who needed hope. Yet that same fire terrified her. She couldn't shake the gnawing fear that it might one day consume him, that he'd give everything, his health, his peace, maybe even his life, to a system so stubbornly resistant to change. As the investigation into Ethan Grayson's corruption unfolded, her emotions churned like a storm. She didn't want to lose him to this fight, but she couldn't deny the pride swelling in her chest as she saw him stand tall against the tide. The case had begun to snowball, pulling in voices that had once been silenced by fear. People stepped forward, their stories spilling out like water breaching a dam, each one emboldened by the spotlight now glaring on the precinct's dark underbelly. Malcolm threw himself into the work with a fervor that left Tiana both awestruck and exhausted just watching him. Day after day, he sat with federal agents, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pieced together testimonies, dozens, then hundreds, into a tapestry of evidence that couldn't be ignored. Each account carried its own weight, a jagged shard of pain that cut deep into anyone who heard it. For Malcolm, it was a relentless reminder of the damage inflicted by those who'd abused their power. Yet, within that pain, he found fuel. The sheer volume of voices strengthened his resolve, a living testament to what could happen when people refused to stay quiet any longer. One humid afternoon, the air thick with the scent of rain, Tiana and Malcolm arrived at a modest community center, nestled in a neighborhood lined with weathered brick homes and sagging porches. Inside, the small room buzzed with life, community leaders, activists, and everyday folks crammed shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with determination. The walls, peeling with faded paint, seemed to lean in, as if eager to hear what would unfold. Tiana wheeled herself through the doorway, her hands trembling slightly on the rims of her chair. The hum of recognition rippled through the crowd, soft murmurs and nods acknowledging her as the spark that had ignited this movement. Malcolm walked beside her, his steady presence a quiet anchor. When he rested a hand on her shoulder, she felt the warmth of his pride radiating through her, steadying her nerves. The meeting erupted into a symphony of voices, some sharp with anger, others trembling with hope. A weary man with graying hair spoke of his son, lost to a brutality no one had answered for. A young woman with fierce eyes recounted years of harassment, her words slicing through the room like a blade. Tiana listened, her heart pounding as she absorbed every story, every plea. Her mind raced, ideas flickering like sparks. What could she say? What could she do to turn this raw energy into something lasting? The intensity of it all pressed against her, but she refused to shrink back. Then, as the clamor settled, an older man with deep lines carved into his face turned to her. His eyes were gentle yet piercing, his voice steady as stone. "Tiana," he said, pausing as if to let the weight of her name fill the space. "You've shown a courage most of us only dream of. Your story, it's woken people up, made them believe we can actually change things. So tell us, what's next? How do we keep this fire burning?" The question hit her like a physical force, pinning her beneath its gravity. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she faltered, glancing at Malcolm. His nod was small but brimming with trust, urging her forward. She drew a shaky breath, her hands clenching in her lap, then lifted her chin. "I think we have to keep telling the truth," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "We need to show people what's really happening, put faces to the pain, names to the ones who've suffered and the ones who've caused it. Numbers and reports, they're easy to brush off, but stories real, human stories, those stick. They haunt you. We've got to make this personal. Because it is personal." Her words lingered, heavy and electric. As the room fell into a hushed reverence, Malcolm's gaze locked on her, a storm of emotions swirling in his ice pride, awe, a touch of disbelief at the woman she was becoming. The leader nodded, his weathered face softening with agreement. "You're right," he said, his tone rich with conviction. "Stories are what stir the soul. Yours already has. It's why we're here. We've got to keep pushing, keep holding them accountable. Make sure the changes we're screaming for don't just fade into empty promises." The room ignited again, voices weaving plans and dreams into a fragile but fierce blueprint for the future. By the time they stepped outside, the sky bruised purple with dusk. Tiana felt a fire of her own kindling, within her a purpose sharp and unyielding. In the car, she turned to Malcolm, her voice low but laced with steel. "I want to do more, Dad. I don't want to just sit back and watch you want to be in this like you." He glanced at her, his jaw tightening as pride wrestled with worry. "You're already doing so much, Tiana," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Your story, it's shifted everything." She shook her head, her braids swaying with the motion. "It's not enough. I want to help people, really help them, the way you do. I want to make sure this doesn't end with us." Malcolm's chest ached with a bittersweet swell, knew the toll this fight could take, the way it could carve pieces from you over time. But as he looked into her eyes, fierce and unyielding, he saw a strength that dwarfed his fears. She wasn't just reddish, was a force. "Then we'll do it together," he said at last, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever it takes. We'll keep going. We'll build something that lasts." Tiana's lips curved into a determined smile, and as the city lights blurred past them, the road ahead felt less lonely. They had each other and a swelling chorus of voices behind them, all chasing a world where justice wasn't a distant dream, but a hard-won reality. Months later, the saga reached its thunderous climax, a reckoning neither Tiana nor Malcolm could have fully braced for. The federal investigation had torn through the precinct like a wildfire, exposing not just Ethan Grayson, but a sprawling network of corruption that snaked through ranks and offices far beyond their city. The trials stretched on, a grueling spectacle of officers and officials turning on one another, their polished badges tarnished as they scrambled to save themselves. One by one, the pillars of silence toppled, crushed beneath a mountain of evidence too vast to deny. On the final day of sentencing, Tiana sat beside Malcolm in the courtroom, the air thick with tension. The judge's voice rang out, steady and unyielding, as she delivered Ethan's fated case behind bars. His badge stripped, his pension gone, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of power twisted into ruin. As he was led away, handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights, his face was a hollow shell, arrogance drained, defiance shattered. Tiana watched, her heart steady. She felt no flicker of pity, no surge of victory, just a quiet, heavy closure as justice settled into place. Malcolm's hand found her shoulder, his touch grounding her as the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. "It's over," he whispered, his voice a mix of relief and something deeper, something raw. "You did this, Tiana. You stood up, and the truth came out because of you." Her eyes shimmered as she turned to him, a tear catching the light. "We did it," she corrected, her voice soft but firm. "I couldn't have faced this without you." In the weeks that followed, the city felt the aftershocks. New leadership swept into the police department. Accountability measures locked into place. Community boards rose to give residents a voice. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress, a fragile step toward something better. For Tiana, the end of the trials was just a beginning. She took her story to school auditoriums and packed community halls, her voice steady as she spoke of resilience and resistance. What fear had once muted now rang out clear and strong, a beacon for others to rise. She founded a non-profit, pouring her energy into supporting victims of misconduct, offering legal aid, resources, a hand to hold for those navigating the wreckage of injustice. The work lit her up, each small victory a brick in the foundation of a future she believed in. Malcolm, too, found new purpose. He stayed with the FBI, redirecting his focus to internal investigations, rooting out rot with a quiet, relentless precision. The long nights didn't dim his resolve, and no matter how grueling the days, he always carved out time for Tiana, their bond a steel thread woven through every battle they faced. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, they sat on their back porch, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass. Tiana's gaze drifted to the horizon, her thoughts wandering. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't recorded that video?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm leaned back, his chair creaking under him, his eyes fixed on her. "I do," he admitted, a shadow crossing his face. "And it keeps me up sometimes. But you did record it, Tiana. You chose to fight, even when it scared you to death. That's what turned the tide." She nodded, her throat tightening as memories of the voiceless flickered through her mind. "I still think about the ones who didn't get this," she said, her voice cracking. "The ones no one fought for." Malcolm reached for her hand, his grip firm and warm. "That's why we don't stop," he said, his tone resolute. "We fight for them, the ones who couldn't, and the ones who still need us." Their words settled between them, a quiet vow carried on the evening breeze. As the last light faded, a calm wrapped around them, not the absence of struggle, but the peace of knowing they'd carved a mark on the world. Justice, they'd learned, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about ensuring the innocent didn't suffer in silence. And together, with every step, they were building that truth into something unbreakable. The air inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the restless energy of travelers, families dragging suitcases, business people clutching briefcases, and tourists fumbling with maps. Amid this chaotic symphony, Stephen Ween stepped through the glass doors, his presence cutting through the noise like a steady undercurrent. His polished leather shoes tapped rhythmically against the gleaming tile floor, each step purposeful, deliberate. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that hugged his frame just right, paired with a crisp white shirt unmarred by a single wrinkle, he exuded an effortless authority. His sleek black carry-on bag hung from his shoulder, swaying slightly with his stride, a silent testament to years spent navigating airports like this one. To Stephen, these places were rarely more than fleeting waypoints, blurred transitions between one destination and the next. But today, something stirred within him, a faint flicker of anticipation. The meeting awaiting him in Los Angeles wasn't just another deal to close. It carried a weight that tugged at something deeper, something personal. He approached the security checkpoint with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. His sharp eyes scanned the snaking lines, quickly settling on one that moved with brisk efficiency. Handing over his ID and boarding pass to the TSA agent, he stood tall, his steady gaze locking with theirs for a brief moment. The agent's voice was flat, mechanical, reciting the usual instructions as they waved him through. "Thank you," Stephen replied, his baritone smooth and unruffled as he collected his belongings and strode toward the terminal. Airports were second nature to him. Decades of crisscrossing the country and beyond had honed his instincts for these rituals. Yet today, that subtle spark of excitement lingered, buzzing faintly beneath his composed exterior. At Gate B4, the boarding process was already in motion. Travelers shuffling forward in a disorganized dance. The gate agent, her tone clipped but professional, scanned his pass. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Ween," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Stephen nodded politely, stepping onto the jet bridge where a rush of cool, conditioned air brushed against his face. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin welcomed him with its understated luxury soft leather seats, blankets folded with meticulous care, and an air of exclusivity that felt familiar. He found his assigned spot, 3A, and stowed his carry-on in the overhead bin with practiced ease before settling into the wide, cushioned seat. Pulling out his tablet, he began scrolling through emails, his fingers moving with the calm efficiency of someone who thrived on control. Around him, other passengers trickled in, a young couple laughing softly in 1A and 1B, a businessman and a D engrossed in his newspaper, and a handful of others filling the section. Stephen sensed the occasional glance cast his way, subtle but unmistakable. He was no stranger to a flicker of surprise or curiosity in people's eyes when he occupied spaces like this. Over the years, he'd built a thick skin, a resilience that let him shrug off the scrutiny without a second thought. The cabin crew moved through their rounds, their crisp uniforms and swift motions a quiet ballet of preparation. Stephen barely noticed, his focus locked on his tablet, until a new presence disrupted the rhythm. Amanda Harris swept into the cabin with the urgency of a storm rolling in. In her mid-30s, she carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who believed she held the reins, regardless of what her job title might suggest. Her sharp eyes darted across the rows as she adjusted the silk scarf draped around her neck, a small gesture that betrayed a flicker of nerves beneath her polished exterior. Her gaze landed on Stephen for a split second before sliding away, dismissive, as if she'd already sized him up. He didn't notice her pause a few rows back, her lips pressing into a thin line as she stole another glance in his direction. The plane's engines hummed to life, a low vibration rippling through the floor, and a soothing voice crackled over the intercom with the standard safety briefing. Stephen's attention remained on his itinerary, mentally mapping out the hours ahead. Everything felt routine, predictable. It wasn't. The sharp click of heels against the cabin floor pierced through the gentle murmur of settling passengers. Stephen glanced up just as Amanda approached his seat, her posture stiff, her expression a brittle mask of politeness that barely concealed something colder. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice tight and clipped, each word measured as if she were holding something back. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Stephen blinked, momentarily thrown off balance, though his calm demeanor didn't waver. "Of course," he replied smoothly, reaching into the breast pocket of his blazer. He handed her the crisp slip of paper, watching as she took it with a quick, almost impatient flick of her wrist. Her eyes narrowed as she studied it, her brows knitting together in quiet scrutiny. "This is for first class," she muttered, more to herself than to him, as if the words didn't quite align with what she saw. "That's correct," Stephen said evenly, his steady tone a stark contrast to the tension radiating from her. For a moment, Amanda hesitated, her composure flickering. It wasn't the ticket that troubled her, it was him. "I'll be right back," she said abruptly, her voice tighter now, clutching the boarding pass as she turned and marched toward the galley. Stephen leaned back in his seat, a faint crease forming between his brows. He wasn't alarmed, not yet, just puzzled. He'd faced moments like this before, subtle challenges cloaked in formality, and he knew better than to react rashly. Across the aisle, the businessman in Didi caught his eye, offering a brief, awkward smile before burying his nose back in his phone. The whispers of other passengers hummed faintly in the background, a soft ripple of curiosity. Minutes later, Amanda returned, her face set in a hard line, the earlier pretense of courtesy gone. "Mr. Ween," she said, her voice louder now, cutting through the cabin and drawing heads in their direction. "I need to speak with you privately. Would you mind coming with me?" Stephen tilted his head, his expression calm but quizzical. "Is there an issue with my seat?" he asked, his tone measured. "I need to verify some details about your ticket," she replied, dodging the question as she gestured toward the galley. He exhaled softly, rising to his feet and smoothing his jacket. "Lead the way," he said, his voice steady but edged with quiet resolve. As he followed her, the weight of curious stares pressed against his back, whispers swelling like a tide. Amanda stopped just outside the galley, the narrow space offering little more than a flimsy illusion of privacy. She turned to face him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It seems there's been a mistake with your booking," she said, her words sharp and clipped. "The seat may not be appropriate for you." Stephen's expression remained unchanged, but a faint spark flickered in his eyes. "In what way, exactly, is it not appropriate?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. Amanda faltered, her confidence cracking for the first time, their SUV already checked. "I'll need you to move to a seat in the main cabin." The silence that followed hung heavy, thick with unspoken implications. Stephen held her gaze, then spoke, his words slow and precise. "My ticket was booked weeks ago. It was confirmed. If there's been a mistake, perhaps you should double-check." Her discomfort flared into frustration, her tone hardening. "I don't have time for this, sir. Either you move, or I'll have to call security." For a moment, Stephen stood still, his face an unreadable mask. Then, with a brief nod, he said, "Fine." He returned to his seat, gathering his belongings with deliberate carriage movement, a quiet assertion of dignity. The walk to the economy section stretched on, the aisle seeming to narrow with every step as whispers trailed him like shadows. Amanda escorted him to a cramped middle seat near the back, gesturing curtly. "Here you go," she said, her voice flat, as if she were offering him a scrap rather than a seat. Stephen settled in without a word, tucking his carry-on beneath the seat in front of him. Amanda turned and walked away, her heels clicking with a faltering rhythm, her earlier certainty shaken. Stephen took a deep breath, his composure unshaken despite the indignity. He pulled out his phone, his fingers dancing across the screen as he typed a message. When he pressed send, a faint, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The economy section pressed in around him, knees brushing against the seat in front, elbows jostling with the strangers on either side, but the physical discomfort barely registered. It was the principle that gnawed at him, the sting of being singled out, diminished. He leaned back, reviewing the swift reply that lit up his screen, understood, monitoring the situation. His eyes flicked up, catching the hesitant approach of a flight attendant. Deborah, her name tag read, was younger, late 20s, perhaps with a warmth in her demeanor that stood in stark contrast to Amanda's icy efficiency. "Sir, is everything okay?" she asked softly, her voice laced with genuine concern. Stephen offered her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine," he said, his tone steady, though his mind was already racing ahead. Back in first class, Amanda stood near the galley, her arms still crossed as she stared down the aisle. Her chest tightened with a mix of defiance and unease. She'd acted on instinct, on a gut feeling she couldn't or wouldn't articulate. But now, doubt crept in, whispering that she'd overstepped. The other passengers murmured among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation. The young couple in 1A and 1B exchanged glances, their earlier laughter replaced by quiet discomfort. The businessman in 2D folded his newspaper with a sigh, his eyes darting toward the economy section before settling back on the page. Deborah, meanwhile, lingered near Stephen, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron. She'd seen enough flights to recognize when something felt off, and this whatever it was left a sour taste in her mouth. She wanted to say more, to offer something beyond her quiet question, but the words eluded her. Stephen sat in his cramped seat, the faint hum of the engines, a steady backdrop to his thoughts. He wasn't just a passenger, Ronged was a man with a plan, a vision that reached far beyond this flight. The message he'd sent wasn't a plea for help. It was a signal, a spark. What Amanda didn't know, none of them knew, was that her actions had set something in motion, something that would ripple far beyond the confines of this plane. Justice, Stephen knew wasn't just about righting a single wrong. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that allowed power to be wielded carelessly, about holding a mirror to those who abused it. As the plane taxied down the runway, he closed his eyes, the faint smile lingering. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And the lesson, when it came, would resonate louder than Amanda or anyone could have imagined. High above the clouds, at 35,000 feet, the hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The soft glow of dimmed overhead lights cast long shadows across the rows of seats, where passengers nestled into their own worlds, some lost in books, others drifting into restless naps. In the midst of this quiet routine, Deborah hesitated, her steps faltering as she moved down the narrow aisle of the economy section. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, where Amanda Harris had vanished moments earlier, swallowed by the curtained divide between classes. A faint unease tugged at Deborah's chest, a whisper of intuition she couldn't quite name. Turning back to Stephen, seated calmly in his cramped economy row, she offered a tentative smile. "If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please don't hesitate to let me know," she said, her voice threaded with genuine concern. Stephen looked up from his phone, his expression steady and warm, a quiet anchor in the subtle chaos of the flight. "Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate that," he replied, his tone smooth and reassuring, like a still lake reflecting the sky. As she walked away, her footsteps soft against the carpeted floor, Stephen's attention snapped back to the glowing screen in his hands. His fingers danced across it with purpose, tapping out a message that carried weight far beyond the confines of the cabin. "Proceed as planned. Notify the executive team immediately." He pressed send, the faint vibration of confirmation buzzing against his palm, and leaned back slightly, his mind already racing ahead to the next move. Meanwhile, up in the gleaming first-class galley, Amanda Harris stood with her arms tightly crossed, her posture rigid as if holding herself together against an unseen storm. The clink of glassware and the faint hum of the beverage cart filled the space as she spoke in low, clipped tones to Dennis, a fellow flight attendant whose weathered face bore the lines of too many long flights. "I don't know what his deal is," Amanda muttered, her frustration bubbling up like steam escaping a pressure valve. "Something about him just didn't feel right." Her words hung heavy in the air, laced with a bitterness she couldn't suppress. Dennis, leaning casually against the counter, raised a bushy eyebrow, his sharp gray eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "You mean something about him didn't sit right?" he shot back, his voice edged with a knowing bite that made Amanda's shoulders stiffen. She didn't respond, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned her focus to pouring a drink for a passenger. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, but the tension in her grip was unmistakably its motion, a silent scream of unease. Back in the economy cabin, Stephen pulled his tablet from the seat pocket in front of him, its screen flickering to life under his steady touch. To the casual observer, he might have been crafting a mundane email, his brow furrowed in concentration as he typed, but the truth was far more deliberate. His fingers wove a meticulous narrative, a detailed chronicle of the incident that had unfolded earlier, an account complete with timestamps, each second etched into the record like evidence carved in stone. Years of navigating turbulent waters had taught him a hard-earned lesson. Documentation was power, a shield against the chaos of unchecked actions. He wasn't about to let this moment slip through his fingers, unclaimed and unaddressed. The plane sailed on, cutting through the night sky, its passengers cocooned in the false calm of altitude, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Deborah returned to Stephen's row, her presence soft but steady, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. In her hands, she carried a small cup of water and a neatly folded napkin, which she placed gently on his tray table. "Just in case you need anything," she said, her voice a quiet murmur, her eyes searching his face for some hint of distress. Stephen offered her a nod of gratitude, his lips curving into a faint, appreciative smile. "Thank you again," he said, though his thoughts were already drifting elsewhere, tethered to the vibrating phone in his pocket. As Deborah stepped away, he fished the device out, its screen illuminating his face with a cold, blue glow. A new message awaited him, The executive team is aware and taking immediate action. A ripple of satisfaction coursed through him, subtle but undeniable. He folded his arms across his chest, settling deeper into his seat. Amanda's behavior wasn't just a fleeting misstep, it was a symptom of something larger. A festering flaw in the system, and Stephen, with his unshakable resolve, intended to see it uprooted. Up front, Amanda's world was tilting on its axis. She strode down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, when Dennis intercepted her. A cordless phone clutched in his hand. His expression was a blank mask, unreadable as stone, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or quiet amusement. "It's for you," he said simply, extending the phone toward her. Amanda froze, her brow knitting in confusion. "For me?" she asked, her voice catching slightly as she reached for it. Dennis nodded, his silence louder than words. "They asked for you by name." Her fingers closed around the receiver, and she lifted it to her ear with a brisk, "This is Amanda Harris." On the other end, a voice emerged, calm, measured, and colder than the air outside the plane. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a formal complaint regarding a first-class passenger. We need your immediate cooperation." The words landed like a punch to her gut, draining the color from her face. "A complaint about me?" she stammered, her bravado crumbling like dry sand. "Yes, Miss Harris," the voice continued, unrelenting. "We'll need a full account of the incident upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully." The line went dead, leaving a hollow buzz in her ear. Amanda stood there, the phone dangling limply in her hand, her breath shallow and uneven. The confidence that had carried her through the day dissolved, replaced by a creeping dread that wrapped around her chest like a vice. She handed the phone back to Dennis, her fingers trembling faintly, and caught a glimpse of herself in the galley's polished steel, a reflection of a woman unraveling. Her gaze darted instinctively toward the economy cabin, searching for Stephen. There he sat, a figure of unshaken calm amidst the sea of seats, his posture straight, his face a mask of quiet determination, her stomach twisted into knots, a bitter taste rising in her throat. Dennis's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "You should probably start thinking about what you're going to say. They don't call mid-flight unless it's serious." His tone was flat, but the weight of his words pressed down on her like a storm cloud. Amanda shot him a glare, her usual fire dulled to a flicker. "I don't need your advice, Dennis," she snapped, brushing past him with a force that belied her shaking hands. But as she tried to pour another drink, a splash of coffee spilled across the tray, betraying her nerves. She snatched a napkin, wiping it away with frantic swipes, her composure slipping further with each passing second. In the economy cabin, Stephen remained an island of serenity. His tablet rested on his lap, and every so often he tapped out a few more lines, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, tracking Amanda's jittery silhouette without ever drawing attention to himself. Around him, passengers had settled into their own rhythms, headphones on, pages turning, soft snores rising from the seats. Only Deborah lingered nearby, her quiet presence a constant thread of kindness weaving through the flight. She leaned down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, is everything truly okay? You don't have to say, but you don't seem fine." Her concern was palpable, her hazel eyes searching his for some crack in his armor. Stephen met her gaze, his own steady and unshaken. "Deborah, I'll be fine," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Your kindness doesn't go unnoticed." She offered a small, hesitant smile before stepping back, leaving him to his work. His fingers resumed their dance across the tablet. "Prepare for immediate action upon landing. Ensure all protocols are followed." As the flight wore on, Amanda's anxiety grew into a living thing, clawing at her chest with every glance toward economy. Stephen's calm demeanor gnawed at her, a silent accusation she couldn't shake. It was as if he held a secret, a power she couldn't touch, and it left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't known before. Dennis, sensing the shift in her, kept his distance, busying himself with passengers and their endless request: a blanket here, a refill there. Amanda felt the isolation settle over her like a shroud, the weight of that phone call pressing harder with every mile the plane traveled. Desperate for clarity, she made her way to the cockpit, her knuckles rapping softly against the door. Inside, Captain Andrews sat hunched over flight data, his broad shoulders filling the small space. "Captain Andrews," she began, her voice faltering as she stepped inside. "I need to ask if you've received any updates from the airline." He looked up, his weathered face neutral, but his eyes sharp as a blade. "Miss Harris, I was informed of a situation involving a first-class passenger. Is there something I should know?" Her heart plummeted, a cold sweat prickling her skin. "It's a misunderstanding," she said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "There may have been a mix-up with the ticket." The captain raised a hand, cutting her off mid-breath. "Save it for the report, Miss Harris. Your instructions are clear. Ensure every passenger is treated with respect. Do not escalate this further." His tone brooked no argument, and Amanda nodded stiffly, retreating with her hands balled into fists. The walk back through the cabin felt endless, each step heavier than the last. Passengers' eyes seemed to pierce her, their casual glances sharpening into judgment, or so her fraying mind told her. By the time she reached the galley, a single truth crystallized in her thoughts. This wasn't going to end well. She braced herself against the counter, her breath ragged, her polished exterior cracking under the strain. Back in economy, Stephen glanced at his watch, noting the dwindling minutes of the flight. He tapped out one final message, ready for landing. "All arrangements confirmed." The response buzzed back instantly. "Confirmed. Security team will be on site. Action will be swift and professional." He slipped the phone into his pocket, folding his hands in his lap with a quiet exhale. The turbulence of the situation hadn't rattled him, not yet. This wasn't just about his own discomfort. It was about justice, about holding a mirror to the consequences of power wielded without care. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles International Airport, Amanda made one last pass down the aisle. Her eyes locked onto Stephen's for a fleeting moment, and in his gaze, she saw no anger, no spitty, only a quiet, unshakable confidence that sent a shiver racing down her spine. Passengers stirred around her, fastening seat belts and stowing bags, the cabin alive with the rustle of anticipation. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your belongings are stowed." Stephen leaned back, his calm radiating outward, a stark contrast to the storm swirling within Amanda. He knew the pieces were in place, the reckoning already unfolding beyond the cabin walls. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the landing gear kissing the runway as the cabin exhaled its tension. Passengers unbuckled, gathering their things with the weary eagerness of arrival. For most, it was the end of a journey. For Amanda Harris, it was the beginning of something far more daunting. Stephen remained seated, watching the shuffle of bodies with a detached patience, his phone buzzing one last time. "Security team in position. Proceed as planned." At the front of the plane, Amanda stood rigid, her polished facade unraveling thread by thread. Her forced smile flickered and died as two uniformed security officers stepped aboard, their boots heavy against the floor. They scanned the cabin briefly before zeroing in on her. "Are you Amanda Harris?" one asked, his voice clipped and professional, her breath caught, her eyes darting toward the galley as if it might offer escape. Yes, that's me," she stammered, her voice a fragile echo of its former strength. "We need to speak with you regarding an incident that occurred during this flight." The officer continued, his tone unyielding. As the officers led her away, Stephen rose from his seat, his movements measured and deliberate. He cast one last glance toward the front of the plane, where Amanda's world was collapsing under the weight of her own choices. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability, a lesson etched in the consequences of overreach. The cabin emptied, the hum of the engines fading into silence, but the echoes of justice lingered, a reminder that power, when abused, always demands a price. The air inside the airplane cabin hung thick with tension as a voice, steady yet imbued with authority, cut through the hum of idle chatter. "Please come with us." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the passengers mid-motion. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a wave of hushed whispers rolled through the rows like a restless tide. Amanda froze in her seat, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of the moment crashed over her. Her cheeks burned with a flush of shame and panic, the heat creeping up her neck as she scanned the faces around her curious, judgmental, inescapable. There was no slipping away, no quiet retreat from the spotlight now fixed upon her. With hands that trembled as though they belonged to someone else, she reached for the scarf around her neck, its soft fabric a fleeting comfort. She pulled it free, the motion slow and deliberate, as if delaying the inevitable, then draped it over her arm like a shield. Wordlessly, she rose, nodding to the officers who stood waiting, their expressions unreadable. Each step down the narrow aisle felt like a march toward a reckoning she hadn't fully grasped. Behind her, Stephen moved with a different kind of grace. He stood from his seat with measured calm, gathering his belongings, as though the stairs boring into him were nothing more than a faint breeze. His fingers brushed over the edges of his bag, folding a jacket with care, tucking a book into its placement, deliberate acts that grounded him amid the chaos. The passengers nearby watched, their eyes flickering with intrigue and unease. But Stephen's pace remained steady, unrushed. He stepped into the aisle, his broad shoulders squared, his presence quietly commanding despite the weight of their scrutiny. Deborah, the flight attendant from economy with a gentle demeanor that had softened the edges of the long flight, approached him again. Her steps were tentative, her hands clasped nervously in front of her as she spoke. "Mr. Ween," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with a sincerity that trembled on the edge of apology. "I just want to say I'm so sorry for what happened back there. I don't know everything, but it wasn't right." Her eyes, wide and earnest, searched his face for a reaction. Stephen turned to her, his gaze warm but carrying a gravity that made her breath hitch. "Thank you, Deborah," he replied, his tone soft yet resolute. "I noticed how kind you were throughout the flight, even when things got tense. I'll make sure others see that too." For a moment, Deborah blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected praise. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice fading into a near-silent breath as she stepped aside, clearing his path to the exit. Her heart fluttered with a mix of relief and disbelief as she watched him go, his figure cutting through the crowded cabin with quiet purpose. The terminal beyond the gate was a whirlwind of motion, and sound travelers rushing past with harried expressions, overhead announcements crackling through the air, the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases echoing off the polished floors. Stephen stepped into the chaos, his senses briefly overwhelmed by the flurry, when a tall man in a crisp dark suit emerged from the crowd near the gate. The man's posture was rigid, professional, and he extended a hand with a firmness that spoke of respect. "Mr. Ween," he said, his voice smooth and deferential, "everything's been addressed. Miss Harris is being debriefed as we speak, and the executive team is waiting for your report." Stephen gave a slight nod, his jaw tightening as he processed the update. "Good," he said, his tone clipped but thoughtful. "Let's make sure this doesn't get brushed off as a one-off. The system's been overdue for a shake-up." The man's lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. "Understood," he replied, falling into step beside Stephen as they moved through the bustling terminal. Meanwhile, in a stark conference room just beyond the gate, Amanda sat hunched at a table that felt too large for her shrinking presence. The air was cold, sterile, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across her face. Two security officers flanked her, their uniforms crisp and their expressions stony, while an airline representative, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard clutched tightly at. Across from her, Amanda's palms were slick with sweat, her fingers twisting together in her lap as she struggled to find her voice. "Didn't mean to," she stammered, her words tripping over themselves in a desperate rush. "I thought there was a mistake with his ticket. I was just trying to." The representative cut her off, her voice slicing through Amanda's faltering explanation like a blade. "Miss Harris," she said, her tone flat and unyielding, "the passenger in question, Mr. Ween, isn't just any customer. He's a senior executive with this airline. Your actions didn't just inconvenience him, they've put the company at serious risk." Amanda's eyes widened, her breath hitching as the words sank in. "He's what?" she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The officer to her left leaned forward slightly, his voice low and firm. "Your assumptions, not facts, drove this. The disciplinary committee will review it, but effective immediately. You're suspended." The color drained from Amanda's face, leaving her pale and hollow as the weight of her crumbling career settled over her. "I didn't know," she murmured, but the words rang empty, a weak echo in the unforgiving room. While Amanda wrestled with the wreckage of her choices, Stephen was already forging ahead. In a private lounge tucked away from the terminal's chaos, he stood before a small group of executives, their faces etched with a mix of concern and determination. The room was plush, all muted tones and leather chairs, but the atmosphere was taut with purpose. Stephen's voice carried a quiet intensity as he recounted the flight's events. His hands clasped behind his back. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he said, pausing to let his words settle. "It's about what it reveals, a culture that's let cracks widen into chasms. Incidents like this don't spring up out of nowhere." One executive, a middle-aged man with a notepad balanced on his knee, nodded gravely, scribbling as Stephen spoke. "We'll launch a full investigation," he promised, his pen moving swiftly. "Changes will start now, mandatory sensitivity training, bias awareness, all of it." Stephen tilted his head, considering. "And spotlight employees like Deborah," he added. "She handled a messy situation with grace and empathy." "That's the standard we need." The team murmured their agreement, their conversation shifting to timelines and logistics as Stephen stepped back, his mind already racing beyond the room. For him, this wasn't personal, it was a chance to uproot a deeper rot. As Stephen left the lounge, his steps deliberate against the terminal's gleaming tiles. The team he'd left behind buzzed with activity, drafting plans to contain the fallout. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he fished it out to find a message from the airline's CEO. "Thank you for handling this with grace. Your input's invaluable. Well, make this stick." Stephen stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over it for a moment before he slipped it back into his coat. Recognition was nice, but it wasn't the point. He wanted a system that didn't let people fall through the cracks or push them there. That evening, Amanda sat alone in her cramped apartment, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Her laptop glowed on the coffee table, an email from the airline glaring back at her. "Your behavior on Flight 87 violated company values. Your employment is terminated." The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes, the weight of her actions pressing down until it felt like she couldn't breathe. She replayed the flight in her mind, the way she'd dismissed Stephen, the snap judgment that had unraveled everything. Her phone sat beside her, buzzing with messages, some friends shocked, others offering tepid sympathy, but none of it softened the truth. She'd misstepped so badly, it had cost her career, her reputation, her sense of self. Her thoughts drifted to Stephen, his calm dignity in the face of her mistake, and a pang of regret twisted in her chest. She reached for her laptop, fingers hovering over the keys as she began an email. "To Mr. Ween, I owe you an apology," but the words wouldn't come. She shut the screen, sinking into the chair, the silence of her apartment swallowing her whole. Days later, a memo rippled through the airline's ranks, announcing sweeping changes. Among them was a note about Deborah's promotion to senior flight attendant, paired with a glowing commendation from Stephen. "In tough moments, true professionalism stands out. Deborah's compassion sets the bar." She stood in the airport lounge, reading it on her phone, her hands trembling slightly as her colleagues clapped her on the back. "You deserve it," one said, but Deborah's mind lingered on Stephen. She hadn't done anything heroic, just treated him like a person. Wasn't that the least anyone deserved? Weeks later, Stephen stood at the front of a packed conference room at the airline's Dallas headquarters, the air humming with anticipation. Executives and staff filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease as he launched into the company's first mandatory sensitivity training. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone," he began, his voice steady, piercing. "And that's the problem." He paused, letting the silence stretch, the weight of his words sinking into the crowd. "This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about owning the biases we all carry and choosing to do better." The room held its breath, his message a quiet thunder rolling through them. For Stephen, this was no mere speech, it was the spark of a shift he hoped would echo far beyond these walls. As he left the headquarters that night, the sky was a canvas of dusk, the sun dipping low and painting Dallas in hues of gold. Stephen glanced up, his thoughts drifting to Amanda's misjudgment, Deborah's quiet strength, the slow grind of change now in motion. It was one flight, one moment, but it carried a lesson larger than itself. Justice wasn't just punishment for the powerful who stumbled, it was the courage to rebuild what their missteps broke. For Amanda, that lesson came too late, her life a cautionary tale of hubris unchecked. But for Stephen, it was a call to wield influence with purpose, to ensure dignity didn't bend under the weight of someone else's arrogance. In the quiet expanse of a sunlit afternoon, Stephen Wayne sat alone, his thoughts drifting like the clouds beyond his airplane window. The incident that had once consumed his mind no longer lingered as a personal grievance. Instead, it had unraveled into something far larger, a ripple that swelled into a wave of transformation across airports nationwide. For Stephen, the shift wasn't about Amanda Harris's misstep anymore. It was about the awakening her actions had unintentionally ignited. As he leaned back in his first-class seat, the hum of the engines beneath him felt like a steady heartbeat, a reminder of how one moment could alter the rhythm of countless lives. Far from the skies, airport employees shuffled into conference rooms, their uniforms crisp but their expressions a mix of reluctance and curiosity. Mandatory sensitivity training had become the new norm, a program born from Stephen's quiet insistence on change. He'd poured his energy into designing sessions that didn't just preach rules, but stirred something deeper: empathy, an appreciation for the mosaic of cultures passing through terminals daily, and a fierce belief that every traveler deserved respect. Stephen wasn't there to lecture, he led by example, his voice steady as he spoke of dignity not as an abstract ideal, but as a tangible necessity. The employees listened, some scribbling notes, others exchanging glances, all slowly grasping that this wasn't just another corporate checkbox, it was a call to rethink how they wielded their authority. Among them stood Deborah, her presence magnetic yet unassuming. Once a witness to the ugliest side of her colleagues' behavior, she now carried herself with a quiet pride, her promotion elevating her into a role where her voice mattered. In those training rooms, she didn't just share statistics or policies, she bared her soul, recounting the sting of watching Amanda's prejudice unfold, and the relief of seeing Stephen stand firm. Her dark eyes flickered with conviction as she spoke, her words weaving a story of resilience that left even the most jaded staff members nodding in reflection. Outside those sessions, Deborah moved through leadership circles with grace, her soft-spoken advocacy for fairness cutting through the noise of bureaucracy. She'd become a bridge between the old ways and the new, her every step a testament to the power of rising above. One crisp afternoon, as golden light spilled through her office window, Deborah's phone buzzed. Stephen's voice crackled through the line, warm and deliberate. "I just wanted to thank you, Deborah," he said, his tone carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. "You've been the heart of this change." She paused, her fingers tightening around the receiver, a flood of emotions swirling within her: gratitude, humility, and a flicker of disbelief that she'd become so central to this shift. "No, Stephen," she replied after a beat, her voice trembling slightly. "I should be thanking you. You didn't just defend yourself that day, you lifted all of us up." A soft chuckle broke through the line, and Stephen's response was gentle but firm. "It's never been about me alone." Deborah, in that moment, she felt the depth of his resolve, a man who saw justice not as a personal victory, but as a collective awakening. Meanwhile, Amanda Harris wandered a different path, her heart heavy with the echoes of her past. The sharpness of her mistake aboard Flight 87 still pricked at her, a wound that refused to fully heal. She'd left the airline, her uniform traded for civilian clothes, but the weight of her actions clung to her like a shadow. Seeking redemption, she threw herself into volunteer work. Local groups focused on equity and education became her refuge. On weekends, she stood in community centers, her hands sorting donations or guiding young mentees, her mind wrestling with the question of whether she could ever outrun her regret. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender, Amanda lingered at a workshop, her ears catching snippets of conversation about the airline's new initiatives. Pride swelled within her for what her former employer had achieved, yet it tangled with a bitter pang of remorse. She'd been the spark, but not the hero. That night, she sat alone in her modest apartment, the hum of the city outside her window. Vowing to let that duality fuel her growth, Stephen, ever the quiet force, pressed forward. His name began to echo beyond the airline, his story unfolding on stages at industry conferences. He stood beneath bright lights, his graying hair catching the glow, his voice steady as he shared not a tale of victimhood, but a blueprint for progress. Real change, he'd say, pausing to let the words settle, starts when we own our failures and dare to face the uncomfortable. The audience, executives, staff, strangers leaned in, captivated by his calm authority. For Stephen, every speech was a chance to plant seeds, to nudge others toward a world where power didn't corrupt, but uplifted. Backstage, he'd sip water and stare at his notes, his mind drifting to Flight 87 not with anger, but with a quiet satisfaction that it had become a catalyst for something greater. Months later, on a late afternoon flight, Stephen found himself airborne once more. The plane leveled out, slicing through a sky streaked with gold, and Deborah approached his seat. Now a senior flight attendant, her uniform bore the subtle marks of her new rank. But it was her smile worm, knowing that caught his eye. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wayne," she said, her voice lilting with familiarity. "Anything I can get you?" He looked up, his expression softening, and replied, "Just keep being you." Deborah, as she walked away, her stride confident yet humble, Stephen turned to the window. His reflection stared back, framed by the endless blue, and for the first time in ages, peace settled over him. The sky wasn't a boundary, it was a promise of what could be. The legacy of Flight 87 stretched far beyond that single, fraught day. The airline's metamorphosis rippled outward, a beacon for other industries grappling with their own flaws. It proved that confronting bias head-on, with empathy as the cornerstone, could reshape even the most rigid cultures. Stephen's influence lingered in the details, training manuals he'd helped craft, the policies he'd pushed through, yet it was Deborah who brought it to life. She thrived in her role, her compassion a quiet force that earned her nods of respect from peers and passengers alike. On long flights, she'd weave through the aisles, her eyes catching the small moments a nervous flyer. A tired parent, she'd pause, offering a word or a gesture that shifted their day. She started traditions among the crew, like sharing stories of kindness over coffee during layovers. Each tale a reminder that every interaction held the potential for good. One evening, after a grueling transcontinental flight, Deborah lingered in the crew lounge, her body weary but her spirit alight. She sank into a chair, her mind tracing the path that had led her here. Stephen's face flashed in her memory, his steady gaze during that chaotic moment, his refusal to bend under pressure. His fight hadn't just saved her career, it had reshaped the airline into something she was proud to serve. As she sipped her tea, the chatter of her colleagues fading into the background, she made a silent promissetto carry his gift forward, to lead with the same integrity he'd shown. Amanda, too, forged ahead. Her days of soaring through the clouds were gone, but her work on the ground gave her purpose. Mentoring teens in underfunded schools, she found herself unraveling the knots of her past. Each lesson she taught a step toward peace. The shadow of Flight 87 never fully lifted, but she embraced it, letting it guide her toward a future where her influence mattered. Years later, she slipped into the back of a conference hall, her heart pounding as Stephen took the stage. His words washed over her. Progress isn't linear. It's built on what we learn from our stumbles, and she felt them pierce her core. Tears pricked her eyes as she slipped out, the night air cool against her skin. She couldn't erase her role in that day, but she could keep pushing, keep growing, keep proving that even the flawed could mend. For Stephen, Flight 87 was never about settling a score. It was a fracture that exposed a deeper rotone he refused to ignore. His push for change went beyond policies. He dreamed of a culture where respect wasn't a buzzword, but a foundation. On the anniversary of that flight, a letter arrived from Deborah, its pages crisp and handwritten. She described a rookie attendant who'd calmed a tense passenger with a patience that echoed the airline's new ethos. "This is the future you built," she wrote. Her words simple yet piercing. Stephen folded the note with care, tucking it into his desk drawer, then leaned back, his gaze drifting to the tarmac outside. Planes roared to life, each one a vessel of stories, and he felt a swell of pride not for himself, but for the countless lives touched by this shift. Justice, he realized, wasn't loud or vengeful. It was the slow, steady work of building something better. The skies stretched wide above, a canvas of possibility. They whispered of the lessons carved from that day, how power, unchecked, could wound, but wielded with care, could heal. Stephen's journey wasn't finished, but as he prepared for his next meeting, his mind lingered on a truth. The truest paths weren't about beginnings or endings, but the echoes left behind. Amanda's fall had taught her accountability. Deborah's rise had shown the strength of compassion. And Stephen's resolve had proven that justice, at its core, was about lifting others up. Together, they'd turned a moment of darkness into a beacon that illuminated not just the airline, but the boundless potential of those willing to change. The late afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows across the dusty highway as Jason gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale but steady. The officer standing at his window barely flicked his eyes over the stack of documents. Jason had handed him driver's license, registration, proof of insurance before lifting his gaze back to Jason's face. The man's expression was unreadable, a mask of authority carved from years of routine. But there was a faint glint in his eyes that set Jason's nerves on edge. "Where you headed?" the officer asked, his voice low and gravelly, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Santa Fe," Jason replied, keeping his tone even, measured, as though each word were a step on thin ice. "Family trip." He didn't elaborate, didn't feel the need to. The truth was simple enough, but inside, his mind churned with a quiet unease he couldn't quite place. From the passenger side, a second officer approached, younger, with a weary frame and sharp features that seemed eager for the moment. He leaned down, peering into the back seat where Alex and Brianna sat, their faces half-lit by the fading daylight streaming through the tinted windows. His gaze lingered on them, scrutinizing, as if searching for something to latch onto. "What's in the car?" he asked, his tone clipped, almost accusatory. Jason felt a tightness coil in his jaw, a flicker of irritation he quickly smothered. "Just our luggage," he said, his voice still calm, a deliberate anchor against the rising tension. "Clothes, snacks, normal road trip stuff." He glanced at Natalie beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't said a word yet, but he could feel the weight of her worry radiating like heat. The older officer's lip curled slightly, a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if we take a look?" The question wasn't a request, it hung in the air like a dare, heavy and suffocating. Jason hesitated, his fingers twitching against the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to push back, to demand a reason. But he knew better than to let emotion take the reins. "Officer," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel, "is there a problem?" "Just routine," the younger officer cut in, his eyes narrowing as he straightened up. He crossed his arms, his posture stiff with suspicion. "You seem out of place." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the car. Natalie shifted in her seat, the leather creaking under her slight movement, her discomfort palpable. In the back, Brianna and Alex exchanged a quick glance, her brow furrowed with confusion, his jaw tight with a mix of fear and defiance. Jason took a slow, deep breath, forcing his racing pulse to settle. "We're just passing through," he said, his tone unwavering. "Everything's in order." The older officer stood taller, his hand resting casually on his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his holster. "Step out of the car, sir," he said, his voice flat but commanding. "All of you." Natalie's head snapped up, her hazel eyes flashing with a spark of indignation. "What for?" she asked, her voice rising, sharp with the edge of a mother's protectiveness. "Ma'am," the younger officer snapped, his tone biting as he stepped closer to her side of the car. "Just step out, now." Jason turned to Natalie, meeting her gaze for a fleeting second. His nod was subtle, a silent plea for her to trust him, to keep her composure. "Kids," he said, his voice low but firm, "follow your mom's lead. Do what they say." His heart thudded against his ribs as he pushed open the driver's door, the dry desert air hitting him like a wall. The family climbed out one by one, their footsteps crunching against the gravel shoulder, the tension thickening with every passing second. The officers wasted no time. They descended on the SUV like scavengers, tearing into the carefully packed bags with a reckless urgency that made Jason's stomach twist. He stood motionless, hands visible at his sides, his face a mask of control while his mind raced. The older officer yanked a suitcase open, tossing clothes onto the dusty ground without a second thought. The younger one rifled through a cooler, spilling snacks and water bottles across the back seat. Jason's eyes tracked their every move, cataloging the chaos, the deliberate disrespect. Brianna hovered close to her mother, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face flushed a deep red as she watched the older officer grab her backpack and upend it. Her college textbooks were and precious, annotated with her dreams of a future tumbling into the dirt. Her lips trembled, a storm of anger and helplessness brewing behind her wide eyes. But she bit back her words. "What's going on?" she whispered to Jason, her voice barely audible over the sound of rustling fabric and snapping zippers. "Just stay close to your mom," he murmured, his tone steady but laced with a quiet intensity. He wanted to shield her, to pull her away from this unfolding nightmare. But he knew staying calm was the only way through. Inside, though, doubt gnawed at him, uncertainty about where this was headed. Fear that his restraint might not be enough. The search grew more frenzied, the officers' movements sharp and aggressive. Jason's gaze flicked between them, noting the older one's clenched jaw, the younger one's restless energy. They weren't just looking, they were hunting, driven by something darker than duty. The older officer straightened up from the back of the SUV, wiping sweat from his brow, and fixed Jason with a stare dripping with contempt. "We're not getting the right answers here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Jason's heart skipped, but he held his ground. "I've given you all the answers you need," he replied, his words slow and deliberate, each one a brick in the wall he was building to protect his family. "You've got my documents. We're just passing through." The younger officer circled around from the hood, his boots scuffing the pavement as he closed in on them. "Passing through where, exactly?" he said, his tone mocking. "We don't get many out-of-state cars around here. Your story's a little too clean, don't you think?" Natalie stepped forward, her patience fraying like a worn thread. "We're on a road trip, officer," she said, her voice sharp with exasperation. "What more do you want from us?" Her hands trembled at her sides, but her stance was defiant. A mother pushed to her limit. The older officer shot her a withering glare before turning back to Jason. "I think it's time to check IDs for everyone in the car," he said, his words clipped and final. Jason's eyes darkened, a shadow passing over his features. "There's no reason for that," he said, his voice low, a warning woven into its calm. But the officer ignored him, gesturing to his partner with a curt nod. "Start with her," he said, pointing at Brianna. Her breath hitched, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Jason's hand shot out, resting firmly on her arm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said quietly, his touch a tether to keep her grounded. His eyes never left the officers, tracking their every twitch. The younger officer stepped toward Brianna, his heavy boots thudding against the ground. But before he could reach her, Alex's phone buzzed loudly in his pocket. The boy fumbled with it, his hands shaking as he pulled it out, casting a nervous glance at his dad. "I'm recording this," Alex said, his voice trembling but carrying a defiant edge, loud enough to cut through the tension. The older officer whipped around, his face tightening. What are you doing with that phone?" he barked. "I'm recording," Alex repeated, holding the device up with unsteady hands, the red dot on the screen blinking like a beacon. "This is illegal, and I'm not letting you mess with my family." Jason's chest tightened, a pang of dread mixing with pride. He didn't stop. Alex scowled and stop him. If this was going to spiral, he wanted every moment captured, every injustice laid bare. His son's courage wasn't just about defiance, it was about justice, about ensuring the truth wouldn't be buried under the weight of these men's badges. The younger officer lunged forward, snatching at the phone. "Give me that," he snarled. But Alex clung to it, his fingers white-knuckled. "Give it back," Alex shouted, his voice cracking with fear and fury as he stumbled backward. The older officer grabbed Alex's arm, yanking him away from his partner with a rough tug. "You should have kept quiet, kid," he growled, his grip tightening until Alex winced. Jason's calm shattered like glass. "Let him go," he said, his voice rising with a raw edge he could no longer suppress. The younger officer ripped the phone from Alex's grasp and with a flick of his wrist, sent it crashing to the concrete. The screen splintered, the sound sharp and final. Jason's breath caught as he watched the officers' faces flush not just with anger, but with something deeper, something uglier. Hate. It was a look he'd seen before, a shadow of power twisted into cruelty. "Look what you've done," Jason said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "You've broken his phone." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions tight with a quiet, simmering fury. The younger one stood there, still clutching the shattered device, its jagged edges glinting in the fading light. Jason's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of this encounter. This wasn't routine anymore. It never had been. They didn't want answers. They wanted dominance. A chance to flex their authority over a family they decided didn't belong. "We're not criminals," he said, his voice rising for the first time, cutting through the dry air. "We're a family trying to celebrate a major achievement. Why are you doing this?" His words echoed unanswered, swallowed by the officer's singular focus. The younger one reached for his handcuffs, his movements brash, emboldened by the power he thought he wielded. "All of you," he barked, "turn around and put your hands behind your backs." Brianna gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "Dad." "It's okay," Jason said softly, raising a hand to quiet her. Though his gaze burned with a fierce intensity, he turned to the officers. His patience stretched to its breaking point. "You're making a big mistake." The older officer sneered, his hand hovering near his taser. "The only mistake here is letting you think you could pull something over on us." Jason exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. "Last chance," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Walk away now." The officers smirked, their confidence swelling as they closed in. The older one stepped closer, his shadow looming over Jason, while the younger one's hand twitched toward his holster. "Or what?" the older one taunted. Jason moved with a calm, deliberate grace, his hand slipping into his jacket pocket. The younger officer tensed, his fingers darting to his weapon. "What are you doing?" he snapped, his voice sharp with alarm. Jason ignored him, pulling out a slim black wallet with a slow, practiced motion. He flipped it open, revealing a gold badge and an ID card that caught the sunlight in a fleeting gleam. The words Central Intelligence Agency stood out in stark relief, unmistakable even in the dimming light. For a moment, the world stopped. The smug grins on the officers' faces melted into bewilderment. Then dread. The younger one stumbled back, his hand falling limp from his holster. "You're CIA," the older officer muttered, his voice cracking, a tremor of fear breaking through his bravado. "That's right," Jason said, his tone steady, unshakable. "And what you're doing here, this isn't just wrong, it's criminal." The younger officer stammered, his face paling. "We didn't know." "You didn't care," Jason cut in, his words sharp as a blade. "That's the problem. You saw my family, and you made assumptions. You thought you could get away with this because you had the power, or so you thought." The officers shifted, their confidence crumbling like dry earth underfoot. Jason stepped closer, his presence commanding, his eyes locked onto theirs with an intensity that pinned them in place. "You violated our rights," he said, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "You've harassed us, destroyed our property, and traumatized my kids. This isn't just a mistake, it's a lesson. Power doesn't give you the right to trample over people. Justice doesn't bend to your whims. And the consequences, they're coming for you now." The air hung heavy with the weight of his words, a reckoning born not of vengeance, but of truth. The officers stood frozen, their authority stripped bare, exposed as fragile and hollow. Jason's family gathered behind him, their fear giving way to a quiet strength, a shared resolve forged in the fire of this ordeal. The badge in his hand wasn't just a shield, it was a mirror, reflecting the cost of unchecked power and the enduring power of accountability. The sun hung low over the dusty highway, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt where Jason Carter stood, his broad shoulders squared and his gaze unrelenting. Behind him, his teenage daughter Brianna and his son Alex lingered, their breaths uneven, their wide eyes flickering between terror and a budding reverence for the man who anchored them. The air was thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone present. Natalie, Jason's wife, let out a jagged breath, her rigid posture softening as the adrenaline that had gripped her for hours began to ebb away. She rubbed her arms as if chasing away a chill, her dark eyes darting toward her husband with a mixture of exhaustion and unspoken gratitude. Jason's voice cut through the stillness, sharp as a blade. "You want to keep pushing this?" he asked, his tone laced with an edge that made the older officer flinch. "Or maybe it's time you start figuring out how you're going to explain this mess to your bosses." The older officer, a grizzled man with graying stubble and a face weathered by years of unchallenged authority, swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed as his gaze flicked nervously to the gleaming CIA badge, pinned to Jason's jacket, a small, metallic symbol that carried the weight of a thunderclap. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his confidence crumbling like dry earth underfoot. Brianna shifted closer to her father, her sneakers scuffing the gravel as she clutched the hem of her sweatshirt. Her heart raced, a chaotic drumbeat in her chest, as she whispered, "Is this really happening, Dad?" Her voice trembled, fragile yet tinged with wonder. Jason's stern expression softened for a fleeting moment as he glanced down at her, his daughter's round face framed by a cascade of dark curls. He wanted to shield her from the ugliness of the world he knew too well, but the fire in her eyes told him she was already stepping into it alongside him. "It shouldn't be," he murmured, resting a hand on her shoulder, "but we're going to make damn sure it doesn't happen again." The younger officer, barely out of his 20s, stood a few paces away, his uniform crisp but his composure fraying. His hands shook as he stared at the jagged shards of Alex's phone scattered across the pavement, the device a casualty of his earlier recklessness. He couldn't bring himself to meet Jason's eyes, those steady, piercing eyes that seemed to bore straight through him, stripping away the bravado he'd worn like armor just minutes ago. "Save it," Jason snapped when the older officer tried to mutter some half-hearted excuse about a misunderstanding. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." His words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding. As the officers faltered, their arrogance dissolving into a puddle of stammered apologies and averted gazes. Beyond the roadside, the damage they'd inflicted was already spreading, rippling outward like a stone tossed into still water. Passing cars slowed to a crawl, their tires humming against the asphalt as curious drivers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. A woman in a minivan squinted through her windshield, her brow furrowing as she pieced together the scene. The wrecked luggage spilling clothes across the dirt, the glinting shards of glass from Alex's phone, and the towering figure of Jason standing resolute amidst the chaos. The weight of those watching eyes settled over the officers like a storm cloud, their earlier swagger replaced by the creeping realization that their actions wouldn't stay buried in the dust of this forgotten stretch of road. "Call your supervisor," Jason said, his voice firm, a quiet command that brooked no argument. The officers exchanged a glance, uncertainty flickering between them. The younger one shifted his weight, his boots crunching against the gravel, while the older one clenched his jaw, his pride warring with the inevitability of defeat. "I said, call your supervisor now," Jason repeated, his tone rising just enough to snap them into motion. The younger officer fumbled with his radio, his trembling fingers struggling to find the right button as static crackled through the speaker. A gruff voice on the other end confirmed that their sergeant was en route, and the promise of scrutiny loomed closer with every passing second. Minutes later, a black SUV roared up, its tires kicking up a plume of dust as it screeched to a halt. The sergeant stepped out, a burly man with a buzz cut and a face carved from stone, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the wreckage. The tension in the air thickened, a suffocating blanket that wrapped around everyone present. "What the hell's going on here?" he barked, his voice rough as gravel, demanding answers from the men who now stood like scolded children before him. Jason stepped forward, his CIA badge catching the fading sunlight, a beacon of authority that silenced the scene. "You've got a serious problem with your officers, Sergeant," he said, his voice steady, but laced with a cold fury that sent a shiver down Natalie's spine. "They racially profiled my family, harassed us, destroyed our property. and turned a routine stop into a nightmare that never should have happened. The sergeant's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he turned to his men. "Is this true?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to slice through the excuses they might have conjured. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the ground as if he could disappear into it, while the older one stared at the cracked pavement, his earlier bluster extinguished like a snuffed candle. Their silence spoke louder than any confession, a damning admission that hung heavy in the air. Jason didn't wait for them to muster a response. "I've got it all recorded," he said, his voice unwavering. "My son was filming before they smashed his phone. We'll recover that footage, and your department and my agency will hear about this." The sergeant's expression darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes as he nodded grimly. "You two, back to the station. Now," he ordered, his voice clipped as he dismissed the officers. They slunk away, heads bowed, their boots dragging against the dirt like chastened dogs. Turning back to Jason, the sergeant straightened, his demeanor shifting to one of reluctant respect. "Mr. Carter, I'll personally see that this is investigated. Your family will be compensated for the damage." Jason's face remained hard, unyielding. "Compensation doesn't erase the trauma," he said, his words deliberate. "But I expect accountability, real accountability and transparency." The sergeant nodded again, his gaze steady. "Understood." As the officers retreated, Jason turned to his family, the steel in his posture softening as Natalie reached for his hand. Her fingers curled around his, squeezing tightly, a silent tether grounding him amidst the chaos. Alex knelt to gather the broken pieces of his phone, his young face a storm of anger and relief, his hands trembling as he clutched the fragments like they were evidence of a battle fought and won. Brianna threw her arms around her father, burying her face in his chest, her muffled sob vibrating against him. "We're okay," Jason whispered, pulling them all close, his voice a quiet promise against the fading light. "We're going to be okay." But for the onlookers peering from their cars, the story was only beginning. Word spread like wildfire through the small town, whispers weaving through the cracked vinyl booths of local diners, the chipped counters of gas stations, and the endless scroll of social media feeds. By the time Jason and his family reached their hotel in Santa Fe that night, the video Alex had salvaged from his phone's cloud backup had exploded online. The shaky footage captured the officers rifling through their belongings with careless aggression, their voices barking orders as they handcuffed Jason, his wrists straining against the metal. It was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to look away from, a stark testament to the abuse of power laid bare. Natalie sat cross-legged on the hotel bed, her phone glowing in the dim room as she scrolled through the comments piling up beneath the video. Her brow furrowed, her lips tightening as she read the outpouring of rage from strangers across the country, people who saw their own pain reflected in her family's ordeal, sharing stories of profiling and mistreatment that echoed like a chorus of grief. But there were others, too, their words sharp and defensive, insisting the officers were just doing their duty. The divide was a chasm, deep and jagged, but it underscored a truth that gnawed at her. This wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern, a thread woven into the fabric of too many lives. Jason sat at the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the carpet. His mind was a whirlwind, memories of covert operations and high-stakes missions clashing with the visceral helplessness he'd felt when those officers turned their sights on his family. He'd faced danger in shadows across the globe, but nothing had struck him as deeply as the fear in Brianna's eyes, the fury in Alex's clenched fists, the tremor in Natalie's voice as she'd pleaded with the officers to stop. This wasn't just personal, it was a reckoning, a call he couldn't ignore. He knew the fight was far from over. It was only the opening salvo. The next week, Jason returned to the small town, this time flanked by lawyers and a swarm of reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning in the overcast sky. His agency stood quietly behind him, their support a subtle but unshakable force, unwilling to let one of their own be dragged through the mud. The officers were suspended, their badges stripped pending a full investigation, and the sergeant, true to his word, faced a podium of microphones to deliver a public apology. His voice was steady but somber as he acknowledged the misconduct, promising reforms that would ripple through the department. But Jason wasn't satisfied with promises, demanded action, meeting with civil rights advocates and community leaders to unearth the rot that incidents like these exposed. His family's nightmare became a rallying cry, igniting protests and packed town hall meetings in places far beyond the dusty roadside, where it had all begun. For Jason, the turning point came when Alex, barely 16, stood before a local news camera, his shoulders squared and his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "What happened to us wasn't just about my family," he said, his dark eyes locking onto the lens. "It's about how people with power treat those they think can't fight back. My dad proved them wrong, and now we've got to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The words hung in the air, simple yet searing, a young boy's plea that carried the weight of a movement. Months later, as the dust began to settle, Jason sat with his family round their dinner table, the warm glow of the overhead light casting soft shadows across their faces. The road trip they'd planned as a celebration had been overshadowed by that harrowing day, but in its wake, something stronger had taken root: resilience, a fierce unity, and a purpose that burned brighter than the fear they'd faced. Brianna, now a freshman at Stanford, had thrown herself into campus debates about justice, her voice rising above the crowd with a conviction that made Jason's chest swell with pride. Alex, inspired by his father's unshakable resolve, had begun collecting stories from others who'd faced similar abuses, his camera lens a tool for truth. Natalie, the quiet strength at the family's core, had stepped into the spotlight as a local advocate, her workshops and speeches weaving a network of change through their community. Jason himself hadn't stepped back. His CIA work gave him a platform few could claim, and he wielded it like a weapon, speaking out against the systemic failures he'd once navigated silently. But at his heart, he remained a father fiercely protective, unwavering in his love, determined to carve a safer world for his children. That night, as they finished dinner, Brianna raised her glass of sparkling cider, her smile steady and warm. "To us," she said, her voice ringing with quiet strength, "and to making the world better, one step at a time." The clink of their glasses echoed in the room, a faint but genuine sound of hope. They knew the path ahead was daunting, a steep climb through a landscape scarred by injustice, but they also knew they wouldn't face it alone. This wasn't just one family's story, it was a mirror held up to all of us, reflecting the cost of silence and the power of standing together. It was a lesson etched in the dust of that roadside, that justice isn't a gift bestowed by those in power, but a flame kindled by those brave enough to demand it. The consequences of unchecked authority had torn through Jason's family, but their courage had turned that wound into a beacon, illuminating the cracks in a system too long ignored. And as their voices joined a growing chorus, they reminded us that change begins not with the mighty, but with the determined, with every soul who refuses to bow, every hand that reaches out, every step forward into the light.